started here. Okay, so you know who I am. You know that I'm Robert Schoch. Are we recording now?
Let's go.
Yeah, just
We're in.
now I feel self-conscious.
Actually,
Okay, so you know I'm Robert Schoch, and well, we're all here together in Egypt, and I just want to talk a little bit about an overview of my own work and a little bit of where I'm coming from, what's influenced me, and I call this talk, just for a general name, The End of Tepe, the first time 12,000 years ago, the solar-induced dark age, which we call Siddha. When I say we, Katie and I, so solar-induced dark age Siddha, and our inheritance from an earlier cycle of civilization. And not to be commercial here, but some of you know, if you want to read more about it, I've got Forgotten Civilization, Origins of the Sphinx, came out a few years earlier with Robert Bouval. And I am, yes, working on another book right now. So, some new things will be in there, some of which I touch on here, and then we'll develop further in the book. So, all of you may or may not know, but I'll say it now. The ancient Egyptians, and we're in Egypt here, but the ancient Egyptians, and when I say ancient Egyptians at the moment, I'm talking dynastic Egyptians. But even going back to the earliest dynastic times, let's just say roughly 4,500, 5,000 years ago, they actually talked about an earlier time, which we could translate basically as Tepe. So I'll just use that as an English term. And this was for them the first time, or you might think of it as a time of creation. Sometimes they say the beginning of time, the beginning of civilization, sort of a golden age. And many traditions have the concept of a golden age that was essentially primordial, very, very long time ago. The ancient Egyptians, one way to think of it is it's when the gods lived among the humans. And Osiris, we're familiar with the Osiris story. We've been talking about that. There's some traditions that Osiris was a real person or a real god, if you would, who was among humans. You've heard about how he was civilizing, bringing the arts and languages and laws and religion. But the concept that there was an earlier, what I call an earlier cycle of civilization, and the question is this real or not? Or is it just a myth? Is it just something that the ancients made up to give them more cachet, to give them more credibility? And I have come to view it as, yes, there is independent evidence of such an early civilization, great civilization, at a much earlier period in time. And my PhD is in geology and geophysics from Yale. I'm very classically trained, and the way I was trained was a classical way, that this was all nonsense, this is all myth, that civilization began a mere 5,000 to 6,000 years ago based on the evidence, and I always try to follow the evidence. I'm now convinced that no, civilization goes back at least 6,000 or so years earlier to the end of the last ice age. So that's one of the major things I want you to think about, and I want to just touch on as we're talking here. Now, a little background. How did I get involved in this? Through John Anthony West. And many of you know of John Anthony West. We've talked about him a little bit. And it was really with John Anthony West, and this is John Anthony West and myself at the Sphinx, just actually our last trip together to Egypt. And the work that we did, that he had begun, other researchers, really does suggest that Tepe refers to a real advanced civilization or civilizations that existed in prehistory. Just a fun picture of myself and John Anthony West. We became very close friends. This is in Norway, actually. Katie took that picture when we went to Norway to do a conference and series of presentations. And that's younger me, without the beard, and John Anthony West. And after graduating from Yale University, as I said, I have a PhD in geology and geophysics, 1983, so you can figure out how old I am. I went straight through, so I didn't take any breaks. So I was very young when I got my PhD. When I say very young, I forget, 26, 25, somewhere in there.
Wow.
Yeah, 26. And then I got a job at Boston University the next year, and my serious studies of the antiquity of civilization really began in 1990 because I met John Anthony West in the late 1980s, and he first invited me to come to Egypt in 1990. This is another picture of John Anthony West taken at the Mina House by Katie. You took this picture. Again, our last trip together, and he passed away, unfortunately, in 2018. Now, someone you've heard about already was R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch. And it's because of Schwaller that I'm here today, because Schwaller influenced John Anthony West. And this is sometimes known as the Symbolist School of Egypt. And it was John Anthony West discovering Schwaller that really changed his life, which ended up changing my life in the direction of my life. And what Schwaller, as you already know, talked about and where he studied and focused was on the Temple of Man, or Luxor Temple, as it's known. And you have this in the diagram that I passed out or I sent out, but this is just showing you, recognize it? The ground plan of Luxor Temple, and this is Schwaller's concept of imposing the skeleton of a human on it, and this was before some of his work, Symbolist Egypt. And West really became intrigued by this, studied it further. At the time, Schwaller had not been translated into English, so West ended up translating Schwaller into English, not to publish, but for his own knowledge. Later, other people translated it and published it, so you can get published versions. But one thing I want to point out, and this has been very influential on me, is that West really did love Egypt. There was no doubt about that. But he was not, like many people assume, he was not an Egyptophile, in the sense of, wanting everything to be Egyptian motifs and, that type of thing. But what he saw in Egypt was what he considered an advanced civilization, or the remnants of advanced civilization. And this ties in with coming from an earlier cycle, what I would now call earlier cycle of civilization. This is just a little quote I want to read to you and elaborate on. This is from John Anthony West. A universe in which consciousness, meaning, and order are written into the fabric of its creation. This is what he proposed, and he thought this was in the classical Egyptian tradition. So a universe in which consciousness, meaning, and order are written into the fabric of its creation, as all traditional religions and societies have always insisted. And in this universe, on this particular planet, humanity has been placed for a reason, with unique privileges and unique responsibilities. So he very much believed that there was something more than the materialism, that we're not here just to make money and compete with each other, but that in fact humans are important, consciousness is important, that we have a place in the order of things. And he thought he found that very much in ancient Egypt. So another quote from him: "If we believe that the universe is a conscious creation and that humanity is on earth for a purpose, then whatever serves that purpose is practical. Whatever does not serve that purpose is at best a waste of time, at worst evil." So this is where John Anthony West was coming from. Knowledge of that purpose is science, sacred science, which is Schwaller's term, translated. The concept of sacred science. Not just science in a raw sense of being able to do technological things, but also what is the purpose? Why is humanity here? There cannot be the slightest doubt that this science of order, purpose, meaning, and the transformation of the carnal or material to the spiritual was what once prevailed on earth. For a civilization to be worthy of the name, it must be based upon the sacred science. Through the efforts of a number of brilliant scholars, and the first and foremost, West thought was R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch, a number of brilliant scholars over the past couple of centuries, key elements of the lost sacred science have been rediscovered or reformulated. And about the sacred science, he wrote, provided those who understand its laws and the guidelines for carrying out their preordained responsibilities, that inner transformation of the carnal, material, and merely rational beings they were by birth into the spiritual beings we all are by birthright. So essentially the concept that through the sacred science, you could achieve something beyond the pure material. And this should sound somewhat familiar. If you're familiar with alchemy, for instance, medieval alchemy, it was more than just physically trying to transform lead to gold, the material. It was really, people argue, even people like Jung, that it was a spiritual transformation. And that's really what it was all about. So he saw this very much in ancient Egypt, and that's why he had such an extreme interest in ancient Egypt. So Luxor, we just left Luxor, is of course incredible. You recognize that now, right? Because we were just there. And Luxor goes back to the New Kingdom, but Schwaller and John Anthony West were convinced that there was ancient wisdom, ancient science, this sacred science that goes back still further. Some people use the term for it, what? Atlantis. Now, when I first got involved in this, West got very frustrated with me on many accounts, many times. For instance, he would say, I wouldn't make a declarative statement because I'm a scientist. I need evidence. I need to build up the evidence before I'm willing to go out and make a statement. For instance, that the Sphinx looks like it's older than Old Kingdom, Fourth Dynasty. And it was a couple of trips before I was willing to say that publicly because I needed to collect the evidence. I was also unwilling back in the early to mid 90s to talk about Atlantis. Why? Because it carried in academic circles so much baggage to, if you're hunting for Atlantis, you're some kind of crazy. So I literally would not say the word Atlantis back then. But getting back to Schwaller and West, Schwaller in a single line made a profound observation. And this is now from West, again, a quote from his The Traveler's Key to Ancient Egypt. Some of you may be familiar with the book. Schwaller de Lubitsch observed that, in his opinion, the dramatically severe erosion on the body of the Great Sphinx could not be the result of wind and sand, as is universally assumed, but was rather the result of water. So this is John Anthony West writing in 1985, just before I met him. Geologists agree that in the not-so-distant past, Egypt was subjected to severe flooding. This period is usually held to coincide with the melting of the ice from the last ice age, circa 15,000 to 10,000 BC. So that was John West writing in 1985. He got a few things wrong. For instance, it's not flooding in the sense of water rising, but it's rainfall precipitating down. And yes, we're talking the end of the last ice age, which is now known well. It wasn't known in 1985. That it's now well known that the end of the last ice age, as we'll come to, ends 9700 BC. So keep that date in mind. So this is the background when he first was looking for a geologist. As he would say to many people, he was looking for open-minded geologists or open-minded scientists with the proper credentials to come and look at the nature of the weather, to explore the age of the Sphinx. That's how I got involved in it, through a mutual colleague who happened to know him because this was an English professor, and he had taught at the American University in Cairo. He had met John Anthony West as he was traveling back and forth to Egypt. He ended, just by chance, this faculty member, English professor, ended up being at Boston University, but not just at Boston University, at the very college where I was located. And we got to know each other. He told John Anthony West about, this young geologist, I was young back then, who might be interested in looking into this crazy, ridiculous theory. This is us in 2016, not back then, not in 1990. And John Anthony West came and visited Boston University, gave a lecture. I said, yeah, it's sort of interesting, but who is this guy? I'm a geologist. You've got all these PhD Egyptologists. I'm sure they know what they're talking about. But he convinced me, and I said, I can't really tell you anything based on photographs because photographs can be deceiving. I have to see it in real life. I thought that would be the end of the conversation. Next thing I know, he's saying, well, I've made arrangements, all expenses paid. No, I can't pay you for anything, but I'll pay your expenses to go to Egypt if you'll take a look at it. And I felt very guilty. I said, I've never been to Egypt. That might be interesting. I'll get a free trip to Egypt. But I felt guilty because I figured that within minutes I would know why he was wrong and why all the Egyptologists were correct, that the Sphinx is simply 2500 BC, end of story. Well, it didn't work out that way. So we went to Egypt first in 1990. These are just some fun pictures of us together. This is actually at the Mina House again. And of course, you see with the Sphinx. At that time, to give you the background, the standard paradigm for the origins of civilization was something that was really popularized and espoused by a man named V. Gordon Childe, one of the great anthropologists, archaeologists of the last century. And this is still the dogma that is circulated in most universities and most people carry in their heads as their classic worldview. And I always, when I talk about this to my students, my on-campus students, I always look it up to make sure that major universities are still perpetuating this dogma. And they are. That there's fundamental evolutionary stages of humanity, that we started out as savages, basically gatherers, hunters, foragers. Then you slowly evolve or develop to barbarism, where you have a little bit of early cultivation, agriculture. You start developing villages. This is sometimes known as the Neolithic Revolution or the Agricultural Revolution. Then eventually you hit the stage of high culture and civilization. And you can recognize civilization in the archaeological record because you have monumental architecture. So keep that in mind. You have relatively sophisticated technology that you would need to carve that monumental architecture. You have literacy or writing, and you have urbanization or cities. And this last stage, according to the standard dogma, doesn't occur till 4,000, 3,000 BC. Let's just say 3,500 BC, particularly in Mesopotamia, and Egypt, maybe somewhat simultaneously China. And this has always been known as the urban revolution. And here I have my disclaimer. This is incorrect, as far as I'm concerned, based on the evidence that we now have. So I go to Egypt in 1990. According to the standard chronology, civilization first arises about 3,500 BC. The Sphinx is 2,500 BC. End of story. That's how Egyptologists see it. And I found that the standard chronology, literally within 60 seconds or so, 90 seconds, there was a problem. 90 seconds of first seeing the Sphinx. I knew as a geologist there was a problem. The Sphinx, of course, is located on the Giza Plateau. I don't need to tell you that. You've seen it, and we will see it again, carved from the limestone bedrock. And as you already know, it's just largely below ground level. Only the head stuck up above ground level as far as we could determine initially. And it may have, yes, been what's known as a yardang or a knoll that was carved initially. But remember, is it the original head?
No.
No, it's a recarved head. And we'll come back there. That is me for scale.
Professor, what'd you say about the head?
It's been recarved. It's not the original head, not the original head, which is an important point because many Egyptologists say to me, that's a dynastic head. I don't want to sound the wrong way, but duh. Yes, it's a dynastic head, but it's too small for the body. It's not the original head. Does that make sense to everyone? We'll come back. So there's the Sphinx, you know that, and the problem is the Sphinx sits on the edge of the Sahara Desert. You've already experienced that, which has been hyper-arid for the last 5,000 plus years, which is essentially all civilization's alleged history, all the Sphinx's history. So there's a huge problem when you go as a geologist and you see that the core body of the Sphinx, and especially the walls, and we're going to walk around the Sphinx enclosure, so I'll show this to you in person. The walls, no doubt in my mind, are eroded by water. This is not what you get in a hyper-arid situation. When I first presented this to my geological colleagues at Geological Society of America meeting in 1991, first public presentation of this tentatively, my geological colleagues said, yeah, it's obvious. It's 100% obvious. In fact, they said so, they didn't mean an insulting way, but it's like so simplistic. This is like geology 101. Why didn't anyone ever mention this before? Well, they're Egyptologists. And I don't mean that in a mean way, but they don't know geology. So what you have, and it's very diagnostic, is you get what's known as this rounded, rolling, undulating weathering. That's what I call it. And these fissures. Do you see how fissures will develop from water coming down from above? And you've already been on the plateau, and you know how the plateau slopes slightly towards the Sphinx enclosure. So when you had rain before the end of the last ice age, it would pour down the plateau, pour down the sides, and I want to point out, I'll do it right now, that water flow on the plateau hydrogeologically was cut off when they quarried rock to build the Great Pyramid. And as some geologists have said to me very bluntly, and yes, I had already realized it, it's not a matter of if the Sphinx is older than the Great Pyramid, which supposedly, according to Egyptologists, was built before the Sphinx was carved. It's a matter of how much older, and based on the level of water and erosion, it has to be quite a bit older. But we'll come back to it. So here we have, this is younger me and John Anthony West. See how he's standing in one of the fissures? I believe this fissure has now been cemented in. We'll go look at it. But you get this rounded profile here. We'll be right there later. That's an aerial view, and it's not due to Nile flooding. If you had Nile flooding, you see how it's a little bit undercut there? These layers are actually much softer down here than up here. If it were just Nile flooding, two things: you get incredible undercutting, and secondly, you wouldn't get these types of fissures because that's only from precipitation from above. So West was actually wrong, that's John Anthony West for scale, was actually wrong about the flooding from above. It's precipitation from below. I'm sorry, flooding moving up. That's what I'm trying to say. From below moving up, it's actually precipitation coming down and runoff. And there's younger me just showing that, etc. Yeah, do I even look like that? And this is the wind erosion. Very, very different. You see how you still have nice flat surfaces, even with inscriptions on them, but you get these wind tunnel effects. Now, according to Egyptologists, this is exactly, when I say exactly, within a century or two, the same age as the carving of the Sphinx. This is just a few hundred meters from the Sphinx on the plateau. I'll point it out to you. We actually went by it on our camel ride, and I don't know if some of you saw it. And this is exactly the same limestone rock. You can follow the strata. One little story, Zahi-Hawass. You know who Zahi-Hawass was? He was very upset with me, still is upset with me, I guess, for saying the Sphinx could be older because I'm stealing Egypt from the Egyptians. And I say, no, I'm just pushing back the dates. It's even a more fantastic civilization, older than you ever expected. They're Egyptians, right? It's Egypt. They didn't bring the Sphinx from somewhere else. But he was very upset with me, so he got a couple of Cairo University geologists to go and check my work. And they were supposed to, their mission was to demonstrate that this was different rock than the Sphinx enclosure and somehow weathered differently, even under the same conditions. They came back with the wrong answer. They said, no, Schoch is right. It's exactly the same rock, and it's weathered under different climatic conditions. We never heard from them again. Yeah, at least scientifically. I'm not saying anything happened bad to them, but I mean, if they had said what he wanted them to say, would we have it all headline? We've made big headlines. He would have tried to. And here's a diagram. This is from Mystery of the Sphinx, where you can see diagrammatically the difference. Does that make sense? And the softer layers and the harder layers, and the softer layers are removed, whether it's by wind or by the rain rolling precipitation, rolling, undulating from the precipitation. Notice again, you get the fissures in the rain erosion, but really not in the wind erosion. Here, of younger me, looking at wind, and there you see. We'll see that. Did some of you see it on the camel ride? There's the wind versus the water precipitation. Again, you can see the fissures, and you can see how big they are. And if they didn't cement it in, I can point this out to you. See this fissure? It's actually like a little tunnel that goes under the rock and through. Does that make sense? That's exactly what water does following the weakness in the rock. You don't get that with sand. You don't get the wind all of a sudden pushing through that way. So it's very diagnostic. There's older me standing there, some additional perspectives, etc. So I came very early to the concept or the suggestion that we have to go back to an earlier period. This is an old paper that was published back in 1978. So that's sort of a slide I've been using for a number of years, one of my classic slides, which becomes dated. But we know that the modern Nile Valley, we have the Sahara hyper-arid conditions for the last 5,000 plus years. And before that, we had more moist periods. So initially, I knew it had to go back to an earlier period. And my initial estimate in 1990s, early 1990s, was not 5,000 BC to 7,000 BC at least. And I was trying to be as conservative as possible and not pushing it back too far. Turns out the Egyptologists really got upset with me. But another group got a little upset with me too. That was the geologists, because they were saying, look, if you really look at your evidence, it seems like it goes back even further. And I'll get to that. So I'm actually very comfortable now that I was underestimated the age initially, and it does go back to the end of the last ice age. So let's just say roughly 10,000 BC for the origins of the Sphinx. And I'll come back to that. I wanted to point out, too, just a few other things we were at. We did not see this when we were there, but we saw that. You see? Everyone recognize it? Yeah, step pyramid. This is on the Saqqara Plateau. You get, among other things, these mastabas. Remember we talked about mastabas? This is a mud brick mastaba. Here, that's actually my own ruler I put in for scale. That's a foot or 30 centimeters. And some of these mud brick mastabas are beautifully preserved. And if you touch them with even the slightest amount of rainfall, it's just dried mud brick, sun-dried mud brick. It'll do what? It'll just crumble and destroy. And you see how even surfaces on it? Okay, the thing is, these have been well dated to the first and second dynasty, hundreds of years before the Sphinx was supposedly carved. If you had rain there, you would have had rain on the Giza Plateau. Am I making sense? This shows dramatically, I believe, how dry it has been for the last 5,000 years. So those who say, oh, you get occasional rain in Egypt. We experienced rain in Egypt, right?
Yeah.
Not even close to what you would need to carve out, to erode a meter worth of rock. in the Sphinx enclosure. Also, I want to point out, we've seen this, but I want you to think about it. When the Sphinx was carved, the body of the Sphinx was carved, this is an aerial view. Sphinx, remember the Sphinx temple? We'll see that again when we go there. They did not just scoop out the rock, chisel it out, and take it out in baskets. They carved out these huge multi-ton blocks and then put them in front, what's known as the Sphinx enclosure. The Sphinx temple and the Sphinx temple and the Valley temple. Remember that? So to me, this megalithic constructions, which are simultaneous with the body of the Sphinx, are in some ways more astounding than carving the Sphinx itself. Everyone with me? I mean, they were doing this at that time. Again, I would date it to about 10,000 BC for the origins. There we are. We'll see this more closely. But do you remember that? And the people for scale and the Valley Temple. Remember we went into the Valley Temple? And just some other pictures, because you've been there now. That's John Anthony West. He would just get in for scale. And this is, I don't know if you remember when we went into the Valley Temple. Maybe we can look at this again if you like when we're back in Cairo and at Giza. This is the entrance to the Valley Temple. And notice how you have the weathered limestone blocks, which is the original structure. And then it was resurfaced or refaced with what? Granite. And I contend, looking at this closely, I don't know if you can see in the slide, that they actually left as much of the limestone intact as possible because I think they knew it was a very ancient, very sacred site. And they actually, in some cases, do you see that, took the trouble to cut the granite to marry it, to fit it to the weathered limestone. It would have been much simpler, much easier to just skim down, make this a nice flat surface, and just plaster on, so to speak, plaster on granite. But they took a lot of effort, I think, to keep as much of the original structure as possible. Remember when we went into the Red Pyramid or the North Pyramid, those that got into the last chamber, what did we find there?
An older
Structure. What I contend is an older structure that they were protecting and building on. So again, the same theme. And I believe now we're seeing the same theme throughout Egypt. Notice here, can you see the inscription? Can you see that? It's even more weathered now. This was taken some years ago, but that all the Egyptologists have assured me that's an Old Kingdom inscription, which means this has to go back to at least the Old Kingdom, which means that the limestone has to be what? Much, much older, and to get that level of weather. So all this type of evidence. We can also look at the repairs to the Sphinx. This is younger me standing where?
On the back of
on the back of the Sphinx. On the back of the Sphinx. This is all filled in. That's 1920s, 1926 or so. Cement that's repaired to. But what you really want to look at is the original erosion on the body, repairs to the paws. This is younger me with modern repairs to the paws of the Sphinx, older repairs to the paws of the Sphinx that my good friend Zai Hawaz has assured me these are Old Kingdom repairs. Well, if they're Old Kingdom repairs, why are they repairing it if they just made it a few days earlier or even a few centuries earlier? He says his explanation is rotten rock. Rotten rock. And we can get back to rotten rock.
It was blasted by the sun.
Yeah. And you're talking, this is the Sphinx enclosure. You're talking as far as we can reconstruct, because this would have been probably not perfectly vertical, but somewhat sloped. But even taking that into account, we're probably missing at least a meter or 3 feet of rock there. So this is not insignificant. It takes time to do this. I did not want to talk about any of this publicly whatsoever unless I had a different set of data that could corroborate it. So something that we did, and this is with Thomas DeBecke, that's John Anthony West, Thomas DeBecke, a geophysicist who I worked with on this to make sure there was more than just me to criticize, there was someone else that people could criticize too, or, cooperation, the work. And what we did is what's known as low energy seismic. So low energy means instead of setting off dynamite charges, we used a sledgehammer on a steel plate as an energy source. And basically, you put energy into the rock. You can think of it as sound waves or vibrations, and it bounces off the rocks of different density. And what this allowed me to do is to look at the subsurface mineralogical changes, also a form of weathering, that occur once the rock is exposed. Does everyone follow? And as the rock weathers from the surface down, you can calibrate that. So, the deeper the weathering, the older it is, and you can calibrate that. And so we did that around the Sphinx. And what we found very interestingly, let me go to the next slide. There's just some pictures of us. There's younger me demonstrating this. Even though this is a weathered surface, and we'll walk around there together, it's weathered technically from a geological perspective. But I guarantee you, if you smash your fist into it, you can do what? Break your hand, break your knuckles, whatever. But it's weathered, and you can see that in terms of lower velocity, seismic velocity. And what we found is that on 3 sides of the Sphinx, it's very, very deeply weathered. It's the scale here is up to 2 meters or more depth of weathering. And then along the rump, it's only about 1 meter worth of weathering. So it's about half the amount of weathering on the rump. And this actually confirmed something I was already thinking about. This is a diagram to show it's a very deep weathering around 3 sides, much more shallow at the rump. And remember when we were at the Queen Hatshepsut? I can't say it now.
Hatshepsut.
Yeah, sometimes
Hatshepsut.
Hatshepsut. When we saw her tomb, I talked about emerging from the bedrock, and it was built in. The Sphinx was doing the same thing, and I'd already come to that conclusion from surface evidence, and I think that's exactly what was happening, and that was the way it was originally carved. So the Sphinx initially emerged from the bedrock, was only carved down to this level. This is an old black and white photograph I took in 1990, 1991, but it shows it nicely, and we'll see this, we'll be down here, that it was only carved down to this level in the rump, but further down, on the other 3 sides. Am I making sense, everyone? And then when they made repairs to it and rediscovered it, refurbished it in dynastic times, 4,500 years ago, they carved out this portion and sort of completed. Maybe they thought of themselves as completing what they saw as incomplete, but I think it actually had a reason for being connected. So here you get that much more shallow weathering right in this back region, nowhere else. And when you compare that to other known 2500 BC carved areas, you get the same level of weathering here, which then allowed me to calibrate the other deeper weathering, and when I properly calibrate that, I get at least 10,000 BC. Does that make sense? So again, independent set of evidence. I talk about this, not trying to push books, but if you want to know more about it, I talk about it in both books. And interestingly, if you think of the Sphinx emerging from the bedrock, everyone with me? You know the precessional ages? The concept of the age of Leo. The seismic tests show how the rump was initially connected to the bedrock. And I say probably a lion. I will tell you now, lioness. So a female lion. And then in the Old Kingdom, they carved it out. So initially, it was connected to the bedrock. And interestingly, in the age of Leo, 12,000 years ago, it would have, on the vernal equinox, faced due east. I mean, the Sphinx faces due east. And on the vernal equinox, 12,000 years ago, would be the age of Leo, and it would have faced Leo on the vernal equinox. And Leo, by the best reconstructions, rising would have risen sort of like this, diagrammatically, with the rump coming up last. Does that make sense? So maybe it's coincidence, but maybe it was designed that way because that's exactly what they were looking at. This is something I've worked on in part with my colleague Robert Bouval. This also ties in with Robert Bouval's what? Correlation of the belt stars of Orion with the Giza Plateau and the Nile, and all of that is aligned at 10,500 BC, known as the first time, or Zep-Tempi again. So it starts to all tie together, and we talk about that in Origins of the Sphinx. So more about it. The head is absolutely too small, I'm convinced, for the body. Can you see that in this diagram? I noticed two things when I first went to the Sphinx in 1990, within the first 90 seconds, literally. One, there was a problem with the erosion and weathering patterns because it did not fit the hyper-arid environment that supposedly the Sphinx had been carved in. And secondly, people have warned me, oh, you're going to have a spiritual experience, and, be careful because it's such a powerful whatever. And no, yes, I have felt that. But being very pragmatic, I also, within that first 9 seconds, said, no offense to you, Sphinx, but your head is too small. No, seriously. And I realized pretty quickly, I couldn't say it out loud, I realized pretty quickly, I had the working hypothesis that that's not the original head. That's not the original head. So, Sphinxes in Egypt, here's just one, and you've seen other Sphinxes already. Do they have much larger heads relative to their bodies? Yes. And here's one. This is in the old museum in Cairo. I don't know if we saw that one or not because they've changed things. And the early speculation in the 1990s was that maybe it was a Sphinx originally, but had a bigger head. Also, the back has been weathered down, so that's not the original back. Some people make a big stink about, the back is so flat.
Anubis.
That's not what a lion would have. Well,
It's
no,
Anubis.
it's weathered. It's weathered down. And it follows strata. And initially, I was thinking male lion. But now we have good evidence, and this is in part with the work of called Dr. Manu Saifzadeh. And this is an article that he and I and Robert Bouval published jointly, a new interpretation of the rare Old Kingdom dual title, the King's Chief Librarian and Guardian of the Royal Archives of Mehet, the lioness goddess. And how this is tying with the Sphinx? It ties in because the Sphinx was originally a lioness representing Mehet, this lioness guardian figure. And we're convinced of that in part because of this statue. It's a statue of Hemi-Unu, who was in the 4th dynasty under Khufu. Remember Khufu, supposed builder of the Great Sphinx? We can argue about that, or if he just restored the earlier structure. This is now in the museum in Germany. And when you look at the statue, it includes an inscription like this. And we've now found this inscription elsewhere. And this is a title of Hemi-Unu. And you can translate it basically, I'll give you the translation in a second, but basically having something to do with the goddess Mehet. This is from another inscription. This is the goddess Mehet. And what Dr. Saifzadeh first pointed out, which all the Egyptologists, they were aware of this, but they didn't know what to make of it, because why would you have a lioness with this sort of weird bent rod stuck into its back? And his observation was that this is not just a weird bent rod, it's a key, it's a physical key. And what we can now think in terms of is this is a key to the lioness, but how does that make sense? Why do you have a key to a lioness? But it does make sense if you think of it now, translate it overseer. So this is an overseer of the scribes of the king. This is referring to inkwell and reed and scribes. So scribes would be keeping the records, keeping the archives. And then master of the key. So again, master of the key to the lioness or Mehet. And a nice way to sort of put it in English is the king's chief librarian, or the archives, and guardian of the royal archives of Mehid. So I'm convinced now that the Great Sphinx was originally this lioness guarding a royal archive. I'm sorry, I jumped. And when you start looking into other inscriptions, it appears again. So do you see it now? There's the lioness. That's the original Sphinx. I'm convinced, or at least the early version of the Sphinx with, again, a form of a key in it. This is another one. This is actually referring to Giza. When we go to see the Sphinx, we'll see the stela of Thutmose IV between the paws of the Sphinx, which is erected in about 1400 or so BC. And what did it represent? It represents the Sphinx sitting over what looks like a building. I don't believe that's a building. I believe that's the archive underneath it. So it's literally a locked archive. Another interesting thing is we have a second Sphinx. Is there a second Sphinx out there? I suspect there well is, and we haven't found it yet. Other Egyptologists have looked for it, haven't found it yet, but that's another story maybe for another day. But we have this here, and we have it here, we have it here. Do you see how this may be representing the same thing? This goes back to 3100 or so, 31st century BC, 500 or more years before the Sphinx was supposedly carved. And when we have these inscriptions, they're referring to the Sphinx as an old structure. For decades, Egyptologists have said it's really strange. We have the Sphinx, supposedly it was carved in 2500 BC, but there's no writing about the Sphinx. It's not mentioned in the literature of Egypt. Well, they think they were missing it because it wasn't a Sphinx. It was being referred to as a lioness, Mehid. And now we're starting to see that, yes, it was in the literature, and they were talking about that as a very old structure, guardian archive. And so you start putting it all together. So we've got that, the archive, and something that we found, when I say we, Thomas DeBecke and I, working with John Anthony West at the time. Remember when we did the seismic work? Mm-hmm. And I was just looking for differential weathering, subsurface weathering. Well, we also found other anomalies. This is anomaly A, the most important one, anomaly B, anomaly C. This is a chamber under the left paw. I believe that is the very archive that Mehid was guarding. And it's still there. And I have no doubt that it's still there. It's fairly large. These are meters. So we're talking maybe 12 meters by 9 meters or so, probably about 5 meters deep. This is an absolute, I have no question, this is an artificial chamber. This is another anomaly. Do you see that? Label B? I think that's a collapsed tunnel. This is another anomaly that we found under the left rump. Does everyone see what we're looking at? We're looking down on it. So the head of the Sphinx, the paws are here, the body, the rump. Now, interestingly, we did not know about this physically. When Thomas DeBecke and I did this, we found what we believe was a void, a cavity under the left rump. And the Egyptologists said, oh yeah, we already know about that. And they showed it to us and we can see it when we go there. You can, if they've removed it, there's a block and you can remove a block and look down there. It's probably late period, in my opinion, or Greco-Roman. But they said, oh yeah, there's nothing new. We knew about that all along. To me, that shows that the seismic data is good. We knew what we were talking about. The same Egyptologists, whose names I won't mention, but you can guess, they said, oh, there's nothing under the paw. Well, look, we found what you already knew about. How can you say there's nothing under the paw? Oh, we just know there's nothing under the paw. Yep. With no data. Am I making you follow what I'm saying? It's somehow we blew it here, according to the Egyptologists, and got it wrong, but we got it right here, even though it's one data set. That's my point. No, I'm confident there's something there. This is from Mystery of the Sphinx, if you've seen that. diagram. There's definitely a chamber there. It gets worse though for me as an academic. There's no doubt in my mind that's a cavity, a man-made chamber, an archive, or it gets worse for me as an academic because I didn't know about it at the time. But this man, have you heard of him?
Yeah.
Edgar Casey. Unfortunately for me, and he died in 1945 before I was even born, he had, during one of his trance states, decades earlier, said that there was a chamber which he called the Hall of Records of Atlantis would be found near under the paws of the Great Sphinx. Now, that's very interesting, correct? Some people would say. Other people, like academics who wanted to criticize me, started going after me saying that, I was just this crazy Caseyite making up data to prove that Casey was correct, which was not the case at all. I didn't even know. I knew who Casey was, but I didn't know he had talked about halls of records or things under the Sphinx. You know who knew a lot about that?
Mark Lehner.
Mark Lehner and Zai Hawass, because they were both. Mark Lehner, frankly, was a Caseyite. I mean, he'll admit that. That's how he started in Egyptology, because he was going to prove Casey correct, and Zai Hawass has had, in earlier decades, very strong connections with the Casey Foundation, the Association for Research and Enlightenment. So they're the real ones that were going out to prove Casey and then never found it. Some people have said that Mark Lehner's worst nightmare, because not only am I contradicting what he's saying now, but I'm sort of demonstrating what he was going to demonstrate in his younger years when he was working for the Casey Foundation, or be funded by the Casey Foundation.
Why did Lehner turn?
Why did he turn?
Yeah.
You'd have to ask him. No, I have my own theories. I mean, there are true believers, and true believers will often flip-flop from one to the other because it's either this or that psychologically, not somewhere in between. But I don't want to speculate about him. I mean, he's well-trained. He got his PhD in Egyptology from Yale University. I got my degree in geology and geophysics from Yale University. But this ties in with another thing. Are those very different disciplines? Yes, very different disciplines, very different backgrounds, very different worldviews, very different emphasis, etc. So we could talk more about that later. So I'm absolutely convinced that we have that chamber there. And if we could get into it, it would be wonderful, because it could, who knows what it contains. I have my suspicions, so I better move on though quickly. We do have the Tutmosis of Fourth Stela from 1400 BC. You'll see this. We got the two sphinxes sitting over, I now believe, the archive. And some people say, well, how do you get into that archive? And I'm just going to give you my theory. When you see the Sphinx, remember this, you've seen this from a different point of view. There's this, this is the Valley Temple, the Sphinx Temple, and this sand here, right? We ran seismic lines here. We ran seismic lines across the sand, and what we found is that there's a cliff face there. My speculation is that the entrance to this archive under the pause is through this cliff face, which is covered with literally meters and meters of sand. And in fact, it may be water saturated sand now. And in fact, there's evidence that the archive, the chamber, is filled with water, or at least partially, because of the rising water table with the damming of the Nile, the buildup of Giza, etc. At one point, I was in Egypt, and they had all these pipes, are these look like little wells about that big around in front of the Sphinx, and they were pumping all this water out, even as they were denying that there's any cavity or chamber there. So, didn't quite make sense. But I feel like in some ways, they listened to me, but they wouldn't want to say that publicly. Okay, so my original timeline, I was pushing back the Sphinx, as I said, 5,000 to 7,000 BC. In the early 1990s, I got in plenty of trouble for that with my academic colleagues and the Egyptologists and even the geologists. the Egyptologists once again say, oh, it has to be much younger. The geologists, if anything, were saying it was probably older based on your raw evidence. So I was not pleasing anyone, but it did make headlines for what it's worth. And I once said this and everyone laughed, so you don't need to laugh because it wasn't meant as a joke. But the New York Times said scientists clash on the age of the Egyptian Sphinx. That's nonsense. It was Egyptologists versus geologists because Egyptologists, are they scientists? No, they're a different academic discipline. But different people, it was different academic groups looking at it and whatnot. And then there was Mystery of the Sphinx, hosted by Charlton Heston. You know why Charlton Heston, right? The joke was among the producers and whatnot, they couldn't get God. So they had to go the next best, which was Moses. And there was so much hubbub about this. So dating is important here. I first announced this publicly, and there's a big hoopla about it in 1991, late 1991, Geological Society of America. All the geologists basically were supporting me, except for one or two who were, it turns out, employed by Egyptologists. And so their job was to say, Schoch has to be wrong. And that was, I want to say, October 1991. By February 7th, 1992, they had arranged at the American Association for the Advancement of Science annual meeting to have a debate about the Sphinx. This is unprecedented to, within months to organize something like that. Because why? They wanted to put me in my place and prove that I was wrong and just get rid of all of this and make it all go away. So it really was sort of crazy because I realized very quickly the Egyptologists were not really looking at the data. They didn't really know what they were looking at or understood what I was talking about. I could go into more detail on that. And they were just being dogmatic, essentially saying that, what did they say? Thousands of Egyptologists have looked at this for hundreds of years and they know what the age of the Sphinx is. I knew enough at that point that there were maybe, you could count on one hand, maybe 5, 6, 7 Egyptologists over the last 2 centuries who are really specialized in the Sphinx. Some of the older Egyptologists, when I say older, back to the 19th century, they actually suggested what I was suggesting, that the Sphinx looks older. That probably predates the pyramid. Mark Lehner. People have heard of Mark Lehner? This is what he was saying rhetorically. This was to put me in my place forever. If the Sphinx was built by an earlier culture, where's the evidence of that civilization? Remember I was talking about the standard paradigm? Where are the pottery shards? People during that age were what? Hunters and gatherers. They were savages. They didn't build cities because he knew the implications. This meant civilization. That is, they didn't have civilization. And the civilization and hunter-gatherer societies, I do want to point out, do we still have both to this day?
Yes.
Yeah, they can coexist. They can coexist. And I was never saying that wasn't the case, but I was saying that, yes, the Sphinx goes back to early period. 1992, important, because it was several years later that this man entered. Unfortunately, he's now deceased. And this is Dr. Herr Professor Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute. There he is, and you recognize me, I hope. There we are talking on site at Göbekli Tepe. And this is in Turkey. And in 1995, he began serious excavations of this site. So that's 3 years later. And I wish this had been excavated 3 years earlier so I could have talked about it at that meeting in 1992. Because here is another set of evidence for civilization going back to that earlier period. This is near Urfa, which is traditional home of the biblical Abram or Abraham, the patriarch of all the Judeo-Christian Muslim traditions in southeast Turkey. And what caught my attention immediately, of course, is he was talking about building phases going back to 10,000 to 8,000 BC, which I had been calling Sphinx Age. Informally. So all of a sudden I said, this could be confirmation of what I was saying. This could be the answer that the Egyptologists, when they were challenging me, where's another set of evidence? Now we had it. So this is in northern Mesopotamia. Here we have the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. Note that it's in southern Mesopotamia that traditionally people say civilization began thousands of years later, circa 3500 BC. And of course, here we are at Giza. This is the area that some people say is the what? Biblical Eden when you look at the Bible. That may not be coincidental. Schmidt thought it was probably not coincidental. And my initial dating of the Sphinx compared to the dating that at that time Klaus Schmidt had was even older. He was dating this even older. Now, just to jump ahead, both of them we can place at the end of the last ice age, about 10,000 BC. So it's an incredible site at Göbekli Tepe. We have these stone circles, 20 or more have been found geophysically. The site keeps expanding and other sites have been found. So this is really evidence of a huge civilization going back to 9,000, 10,000 BC or so, really closer to 10,000 BC. And I just want to flip through a few. Katie and I have been there quite a number of times. So these are from different time periods, different visits, because they've been excavating as an active site, just to give you a feel for it. That was, this one was maybe, 2010, 2012 or so. This was in 2020 when we were there. It's now a UNESCO site, so they built this awning over to cover it. There I am, that's 2010. Do you even recognize me?
Oh.
I'm a little grayer now. And this was in 2020 in January, so it was quite cold at the moment. And it's really an incredible site. I'll just flip through these. But what you have are these stone pillars, which are beautifully carved. And you have them beautifully carved. You have this rubble and whatnot. I'll come back to that. Those are secondary structures, but ancient structures. And this, at one point, they were boxing up. It's very close to the Syrian border. And you know that there's all kinds of political problems and wars and whatnot there. This is what's known as Enclosure C. But do you see how these megaliths are not like Stonehenge? Often people think of Stonehenge, stone circles. Stonehenge, and I love stones, and Stonehenge is wonderful. We visited, etc. But they're big, chunky blocks of rock. These are beautiful, thinly carved with reliefs on them, with carvings in the ground in some cases. Getting closer there. Isn't he cute?
Wow.
Yeah, isn't he cute? Now, this is interesting because I've talked to a couple of archaeologists off the top of my head. This dates back to about almost precisely 9,700 BC, based on the best evidence. And I've asked a couple of archaeologists, if you found this, and he's about that big, on the stone, stone pillar. And I've asked a couple of archaeologists, off the record, of course, they wouldn't want to admit this on the record. If you found something like that out of context, how old do you think it would be? One said, maybe 1,000 BC. Another one said 600 BC would be his rough estimate. No, it's 9,700 BC. It's much more sophisticated than anyone ever expected for the time. Other carvings, and I talked about this in Forgotten Civilization, what they refer to, but that's known as the vulture pillar because it has a vulture type animal on it. There's other ones. And interestingly, do you see how this is a weathered surface? I came to the conclusion, Schmidt came to the conclusion before he passed away, that some of these were actually reused 12,000 years ago, so they go back even earlier, just like we're seeing things reused in Egypt.
How do they date?
How's it date? I'll come to that. But I'll come to it. 2 seconds. So here's more. Notice this is secondary walls that were built later. I'll come to that too. But the thing is, this is actually the first pillar they found. There, isn't he cute? Little fox. And then do you see there's a little piglet there? Yeah, that's engraved in. This is in relief. This is engraved in. And this is probably later than that, but it shows how it was being used over time. at least for a couple of thousand years. This looks like a plasma symbol. Keep that in mind because we'll come back to that. Some of them, you see how this has hands, arms and hands, and a belt? We'll come back to that in a second. I want to flip through these quickly because I'm looking at what time it is. But they're really incredible. Look at this pillar. This is one of the famous pillars. Look at how shallowly it's set in the bedrock. And this is incredible engineering. This is about 4.5 meters tall. Very thin limestone to carve that, to erect it without snapping it. And there's acoustic evidence that these had acoustic properties, may have vibrated, probably freestanding initially. Later, it may have been roofed over. And look at the little animals carved into the base. It's the same pillar. See how shallowly it's set? Schmidt said that when he first started excavating, he assumed that about a third of each pillar would be set into the bedrock. No, we're talking, it's just set in centimeters. And he actually determined that they were using as cement 12,000 years ago to help stabilize them. Incredible sophistication. And as I said, I'll come to the dating in a second. As I said, this is found where some people say it's the biblical Garden of Eden. It's near the modern city of Urfa. It's near the modern city of Urfa. And this is the pools of Abraham. Sacred sites, sacred pools. They have the cave of Abraham, Abraham the prophet. Mm-hmm. And this is sometimes known as the city of prophets. So it's a very, very ancient city unto itself. Now, very holy site for all the Abrahamic religions. And when they dig down, like urban renewal projects, etc., they hit older and older stratigraphic layers. So this gets into the dating, and they can radiocarbon date these. You can look at the stratigraphy, how the layers are laid out. You can also look at what are known as microstalactites and microstalagmites. When, people know caves and you go into a limestone cave, because there's a lot of limestone here, and then the limestone dissolves and then reprecipitates. When it does that, it carries an imprint of the carbon in the air at that time, which then you can use to date it when it was precipitated. Am I making sense to everyone? So there's a lot of good independent evidence for when this was done. There's also some plasters that were found with fibers and organic material that can be dated. So very, very good dating techniques. And in Urfa, when they do urban renewal projects or a new underground parking lot, they often find Göbekli Tepe age strata and artifacts. One of them is known now as Urfa Man. Isn't he beautiful? Come on, say yes.
Yes.
I love him. And he's life-size. And he was found very near the pools of Abraham. And he was found during one of the construction projects. Here, just so to show.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, there he is with me for scale. And this was in the old museum. Then they painted his background so he would pop out a little bit more. And then later they put him in the new museum with his own room with this wonderful blue light. And, they know what they have. He's a real treasure. And, he's very interesting too. Notice the face, with no mouth, but the nose and the eyes. And what's a chevron type and holding sort of his navel area. This is how the Göbekli Tepe people, at least in one version, illustrated themselves. They weren't just primitive hunter-gatherers with, messy hair and, like cavemen. Here I am. This is John Anthony West because he visited with Katie and I too. And we're talking about the actual dating. So we're talking about the dating here, because I have to admit, I was very skeptical. I'm one of those people that, yes, I'm talking about the origins of the Sphinx going back to an early period, but someone else says, oh, they've got this site, it's so old. I get these emails all the time. Oh, I get the things that prove you're right. Well, no, it doesn't prove I'm right at all if I don't buy the evidence that you're trying to present. So I was actually skeptical about but is this really that old before I put my, start using it as evidence? And I discussed it with Klaus Schmidt, and, he respected that, me as a fellow academic, and explained to me, and I read all the literature he had published, etc., and I'm convinced he's absolutely right. As I was saying, you can look at radiocarbon, you can look at stratigraphy, you can look at plaster layers, which are secondary to parts of it. And he also pointed out early on that it was intentionally buried. So unlike the Great Sphinx, which has been used and reused for thousands of years, this is quite pristine because it was intentionally buried. And that's part of our story. And you can see how you have these long, thin arms. And you see the belt there, isn't that a beautiful belt? And belt buckle. I mean, what was that made out of 12,000 years ago? Because this is representing something 12,000 years ago. One of my students once said, oh yeah, 12,000-year-old designer belt. And a loincloth, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, incredible sophistication. And there's my friend, Urfa Man, and I want to say, remember I was talking about the aspects of civilization? True civilization, you have monumental stone architecture. We have that here, 10,000 BC. I believe you have urban city life. They say, well, where are the people? Where were they living? Urfa. We still have Urfa. I'm convinced that the city of Urfa today, the modern city, is the ancient city. They were living there. This is one of the cities that has been inhabited for, I believe, 12,000 years or more, probably continuously. And what else do you need for civilization? Writing. Were they literate? I'm convinced they were absolutely literate. I'm trying to make the case for them now. And we don't have much that survived, but this is again working with Manu Safes today, my colleague. We looked at this particular pillar, this particular belt, and other structures at Göbekli Tepe, and I'm convinced that this is not just fancy symbolism, not just a pretty decoration, but this is actual writing. Does it actually sort of look like writing? It looks like a C and an H and a backward C, but I think it is actual writing. This is why, very briefly, from this area in Turkey and a little bit further west, we have the Hittites. You've heard about the Hittites already, and how the Egyptians and the Hittites would interact with each other. So this is thousands of years later, but the Hittites had their own writing, hieroglyphics, and this has been well studied, especially by a guy named Emmanuel Laroche, and this is his 1960 publication, and he numbered all the different hieroglyphs in the Hittite language and what they are meaning. So he had things like, look at these, divine, and this is a gate or a portal. This is referring to God. It also turns out it's an electrically charged plasma symbol. We'll come back to that probably after tea. And that this has a connection to God. Do you see these symbols here? Okay. And then we start looking at that, and we start seeing these symbols at the Göbekli Tepe. You see what I'm doing here? Yeah. And I think this, for instance, says a path or the way of God. Do you see the H there and the God symbol? Turn side, and once again, this is also plasma symbol. We'll come back to that because I think this ties in the sun and the solar outburst, which I'm going to get to. Will everyone promise to come back after tea?
Yes.
Part 2?
Yes.
Because we're obviously going to need a part 2. I told you I can't fit this into an hour and a half, but I can do it. I can finish it up after tea. But we'll go to 5:30, which is tea time, which gives me another 10 minutes right now. So looking at this is the belt on one side. My reading of this, tentative reading, and I'm giving you a lot of things in a nutshell, is that this literally says God of gods and the pathway to the God of gods. Does that make sense? I mean, you understand what I'm saying.
Based
You
on
have to
the
be
Hittite.
convinced, yeah. But if this is the case, this is real writing. This is real literacy. Now remember, this is 12,000 years ago. We don't have a whole lot, but we have other pillars too where we have similar writing and similar symbolism. And I don't think this is just random. I don't think they're just making it up pretty decoration. And what I suspect is that we're going to find in the future, I hope, actual, we'll call it manuscripts, whether it's on organic material, which unfortunately, organic material from 12,000 years ago, not much survives. They were apparently not using pottery. We don't have evidence of pottery, which is interesting. But do all cultures use pottery? No. Actually, Easter Island, which is something that Katie and I are very interested in, we'll talk about after tea, right up until modern times, until the European discovery of Easter Island in 1722, they were not using pottery for whatever reason. And John Anthony West once joked, silly joke, they weren't using pottery because they were so advanced, they were using nothing but paper plates. But the point is, could they have been using organic materials that did not survive and had written records in archives? Absolutely. We know that's the same for Egypt thousands of years later. So I'm hoping that someday we will find it. But if this were, say, 2000 BC instead of 10,000 BC, most archaeologists would say, oh yeah, that must be a script. We just don't know what it is. It's a new unknown script. But when it's 12,000 years old, 10,000 BC, they'll say, oh, we all know no one had writing back then. Do you see the hypocrisy, if you would? Because it's too old. Oh, we know it couldn't be writing. Here's another one. Does that look similar now to the La Roche symbols? The divine, the gateway, or the portal to the divine, the passageway to the divine? If this were on a Hittite monument, no doubt, they just read it. But because it's 10,000 BC, they say, oh, just pretty picture. So I'm convinced that they had writing, but it also ties in with plasma symbolism. And this gets to something very interesting, that what they were seeing in the sky during a solar outburst influenced them greatly, including what would later appear in monuments, what we would call writing, or some people would call writing. And this ties in with the work of Dr. Anthony Perrott, which I'm going to get to in a few minutes after tea, it looks like. Also, just this is fun. Isn't this interesting? This is from 1922, long before Göbekli Tepe was ever discovered. I've got the original publication at home, so this is a photograph from it. Here's Australian, native of Australia, and look what he's got compared to what's at Göbekli Tepe. So could this be some symbolism that was so important it was passed on for generations and even to different continents and spread out? Now it's interesting with Australians in particular, they have traditions. They have a very strong oral tradition, and it's been demonstrated by fellow geologists of all people that some of their traditions where they talked about, oh, there used to be an island out there and there used to be these animals that no one's ever seen. And people just say, oh, this is a bunch of make-believe myths and whatnot, until certain geologists put it together and found, yeah, when the sea levels were lower at the end of the last ice age, there really was an island out there. And furthermore, fossils of extinct animals have been found which match their descriptions. So, some of these oral traditions can go back 12,000 years or more and maintain their integrity, validity. So could something like that have spread? And I just throw it out. But I think it's interesting. So Göbekli Tepe, there's even more higher level of sophistication. So this is a map from Klaus Schmidt and one of his colleagues, Peters. And what you're looking at here is the ground plan of Göbekli Tepe. So do you see this sort of circular enclosures? These are the circular enclosures. This is a composite photograph that Katie took when we first went there to give you an overview. That's actually me and John Anthony West. Here's aerial view. Do you see the circular enclosures?
Yeah.
Yes,
Which
okay,
is
so what's
lifted.
important here is you look at these, and these enclosures include pairs of pillars in this middle, surrounded by other pillars. Everyone with me? And these pillars look to the south, slightly to the east. North is that way. And they look out, but notice how the orientations change slightly from enclosure to enclosure. I am 100% convinced, and this is me speaking in my work. I drew these lines in on their map to show the orientations. And you can see the pillars. You see how it's anthropomorphic, and you can tell what the front and rear is. As there's the hands. This is the belt you've seen already. And they're looking out to the southern sky toward the east. What are they looking at? I'm convinced, based on programs where you can figure out what the sky looked like thousands and thousands of years ago, that they were looking out towards the Pleiades, Taurus, and Orion, which historically in so many cultures are an incredibly important part of the sky. Orion is one of the most obvious asterisms, one of the most obvious constellations, but seems to have been important around the world for early civilizations. And on the vernal equinox, in many cultures, vernal equinox is one of the most important points in the year, and that we are looking at a situation where that orientation changes slightly over time due to precession. Precession, the slow movement of the stars, that's what gives us the different ages, the astrological and astronomical ages. We're now in the age of what?
Aquarius.
Yeah, well, some people say we're end of Pisces, beginning of Aquarius. We're actually somewhere, depending on who you talk to, that transition. Those of us, well, maybe you've all heard of it, the dawning of the age of Aquarius. Yeah, we're at the beginning. But what's important here is this is the oldest one, and by precession and the changing precessional orientation, the dates of these should be: this is oldest, this is second oldest, third oldest, and youngest, because of the changing position. Everyone with me?
Yes.
And it turns out stratigraphically, geologically, independent of these astronomical orientations, this is the oldest enclosure. This is the second oldest, third oldest. So it's confirming, two sets of data confirming each other. And it shows too that they were looking at the sky over long periods of time. Supposedly precession was not even known about until maybe Neo-Babylonian times, say 7th century BC, or maybe Greek times in 3rd, 2nd century BC. No one was supposed to be aware of such sophisticated, subtle changes in the sky 10,000 BC or 9,000 BC. Am I making sense? So again, an added level of sophistication that we see here. So they were looking out, I believe, to Orion, Taurus, Pleiades. And if you impose this, a little diagram, impose it, this is the actual site, and you're looking out toward the southern sky on the vernal equinox. This is what they would see rising in the sky. And interesting, though, Orion, with his belt stars, travels with his companion dog. And sometimes people think of Orion as the headless hunter. Well, think of the pillars. Do they have a well-developed head? No, they're basically a torso with a belt. Sound like Orion?
And
Yeah.
a dog.
And what?
And a dog.
And a dog. And a dog. Because here we have, remember this? He's carrying a little dog under his arm.
Companion.
Isn't that amazing? And the companion dog. Who's that companion dog?
Sirius.
Sirius. The brightest star. Isn't it the brightest star in the sky?
Yes.
Yeah, and maybe our binary companion. Some people think that our sun may be have a binary companion. That's something we could talk about later. But here he is facing this. We're facing the southern sky. We've got the belt. We've got his arms brought down. I think here you can see this would have been the quote head. Could they have carved a nice head if they wanted to? Sure. We see that in Urfaman and other sculptures from this area. But no, they're showing it, I think, as Orion. and with a companion dog. And furthermore, all of this is enclosed with, remember, this is in the middle of a circle. So you've got other pillars around it with various motifs on it, various animals. So think of the constellation, the zodiac, maybe the 12,000-year-old version of the zodiac around it. Lots of things to think about here. So I'm convinced 100% there was a true civilization existed prior to the end of the last ice age, and that we have the physical remains of Zektepe. This is absolutely the case. And the Egyptians we're talking about as the first time, the beginning. You've heard that already. And we're going to take a break in like 2 minutes. The classical ancients, did they talk about earlier period, earlier cycles of civilization? Plato himself talked about world ages and a golden age, and you have the golden age, silver age, bronze age, iron age. We're in the bottom now with the Iron Age, where you have the processional cycle, the Yuga cycle. Again, all the traditions seem to indicate that we right now are in the bottom of the bottom. Even if we're sophisticated technologically, we're not sophisticated otherwise. And that's actually part of what John Anthony Wester's interest was, to look for civilizations that had that other level of sophistication, should we say, scientific, not just scientifically, but philosophically, religiously, spiritually. And something brought Zektepe down. We're going to see this at Abu Simbel. What could wipe out such an incredible civilization, and why was Göbekli Tepe intentionally buried? So I'm going to leave you with this moment, then we're going to get tea, and you're all going to come back, right?
Yeah, of course.
Lesson number 2, or part 2. Look at this. This is where I want to leave you with thinking about till we come back from tea in about 15 minutes. Can we make it about 15 minutes? Maybe we can get some tea and bring it back here. So we'll start back in 15 minutes or so. This is Göbekli Tepe. This is an enclosure. See what happened here at 9700 BC. And I say that because we have good radiocarbon dating on these secondary walls. Do you see how this is a secondary wall? That's ancient. But what happened? You see this pillar? It got knocked down, and they hastily re-erected it and built these walls to hold it up. See how this one split? And they re-erected. Here we have the same thing. These are beautifully carved pillars with these rough, crude walls put against them. This is done about 9700 BC because apparently there were catastrophic conditions. There was damage to this site. It was horrible. It must have been a horrible time. This is the end of the last ice age with these catastrophic conditions. They seem to have been trying to re-erect the site, put the pillars back in place as best as they could, building these secondary walls against it. See how he's peeking out? You don't carve this beautifully just to put a bunch of old rock rubble against it. Does this sound familiar? We've seen this other places too, in Egypt. We'll come to that. So what are they doing? Why are they doing this? This is a beautiful example. Do you see that? Here's a close-up where this pillar got knocked over, and see how they quickly reassembled it just to get the top in the right position? Then they covered it all over. So what is happening here? That's what I want to talk about after tea. That sound good?
Yes.
Okay. So let's have a tea break. It's 5. So as I was saying, just to go back a little bit, there is evidence of intentional burial at Göbekli Tepe. And it turns out, I want to make this point right now, that Klaus Schmidt came to the conclusion that Göbekli Tepe was intentionally buried. I came to the conclusion independently, looking at the stratigraphy, that it was intentional buried. Does everyone know what stratigraphy is? It's how the rocks are laid down. And you can see how the rocks, if they were just blown in by, the elements, they look very different than if you come and someone lays them down, maybe brings baskets in and throws the baskets down. It turns out that not only is Göbekli Tepe intentionally buried, but other sites that are now being can't talk. Other sites are now being found in Turkey, sometimes known as sister sites of Göbekli Tepe. For instance, one known as Karhan Tepe, which I'll be visiting, and some of you are coming with me to Turkey next month. Is it next month? August. We're still in May. Well, I'm being off. June, July, August. Okay, in a few months, we'll look at other archaeologists have come to the exact same conclusion that these were intentionally buried. And our contention, Katie and I, is they were buried at the end of the last ice age when these catastrophes were happening. And I want to point this out very explicitly because there has been some hubbub, I'll call it that, in the YouTube world that, they weren't really intentionally buried. That was a mistake. No, they were intentionally buried. You can see that very, very evidently. Very clear evidence of that. In some cases, they actually took blocks of rock and they set them down almost like a pavement as they were filling it in, then put in layers of other rocks and gravel and more. This is not what happens naturally. So it's interesting that these were intentionally buried and covered over, almost like a time capsule. So very good preservation compared to something like the Sphinx. And the question is, why would you do that? And again, there's these secondary walls, and I showed this to you before the break. You see how this was erected very quickly, and then they put in these secondary walls to hold up the pillars that had been apparently knocked down, and you've got it there. Sometimes in National Geographic reconstructions, they show the pillars standing up, and they show the walls against it. That's secondary walls, and they show this as if that's how it was intended to be from the very beginning. No, they're confusing two different stages or two different sets of data, which is to me quite amazing that they would make that mistake. Interestingly, and this is something that Katie has been talking about and we've been talking about, not only do you find intentional burial at Göbekli Tepe, this is Göbekli Tepe, and again, I'm a stratigrapher in part. I wrote a book called Principles of Stratigraphy back in my younger years, a textbook on it. So something I've really studied, and you can see how it was intentionally buried up to this beautiful little tree that sits there to this day. Interestingly, as a side note, Göbekli Tepe was considered a sacred site long before the archaeologists discovered that there's these ancient structures underneath. Does that sound familiar? Mm-hmm. So sacred site in tradition remains a sacred site. The local people knew about that. There's what are considered sometimes graves or Muslim graves or markers up there. Does this sound familiar in Egypt? We've seen the same thing just at Karnak today, where you have it. But it was all buried. Now, does that look familiar? Karnak, one of our contentions is that many sites in ancient Egypt may have been intentionally buried also and may go back to a much more remote period than were rediscovered, reused, added to. Am I making sense for everyone? So I think this is something that we have to take into account and have to consider as a real possibility. And that ties in with the concept of Zep-Tepi and what the ancient dynastic Egyptians were talking about, that there was this earlier cycle of civilization. There were these older structures that in some cases they adopted, they reused, they learned from. We saw at Karnak that people see how you could, inscriptions on top of inscriptions, or I was pointing out to some of you at least where you could see how some inscriptions were very, very deeply carved in. Why? Because I believe they were carving over older inscriptions. So the concept of burial and reuse, we're going to go to Edfu. We're going to see Edfu, I think tomorrow, right? Yeah, Edfu. And when you look at Edfu, beautiful temple. And you're going to see that, but also pay attention to all the surrounding mud brick. Was some of that to protect it, to preserve it, maybe to preserve something much earlier? Now, these were used in Greco-Roman times, they were used in New Kingdom times, later periods, But the ancient Egyptians themselves had traditions that they go back much earlier. Again, sacred sites that go back much earlier, including some of the physical remains. Everyone with me? So I want you to think about that. This is all Ed Fruit. Some pictures that we took, the last trip or so on it, and talked about this, and we wrote about this on the website. We're going to see Colombo. You see the same thing here, where right up against the temple you have this mud brick packing, this mud brick. What is going on here? Is it the same concept as we have at Göbekli Tepe and other ancient sites where we know that they were doing this to preserve? So these are, well, you've been seeing the temples, and I just love all of them. But I want you to pay attention to that and think about that and give me your opinion as you look at these sites. So, in getting back to Göbekli Tepe, this is something that we put up on social media, I think, didn't we, Katie?
Yes, when this argument erupted.
Yeah, when their argument
it wasn't
erupted, because all of a sudden there were these people saying, oh, it wasn't intentionally buried. After all, Schmidt was wrong, which is easy to say since Schmidt is now deceased.
It's actually the new archaeologist is trying to put his stamp on it.
Exactly. And what you get, just like the pharaohs, and I don't want to be political here, but just like the pharaohs would put their stamp on things, and archaeologists like to put their stamp on things. And if one archaeologist says one thing, you can be sure there's going to be another archaeologist who wants to say something different to make their name, if you would. But Schmidt was absolutely right. There's no doubt about that. And other Turkish archaeologists, as I said, excavating similar sites now that we're finding of the same period, same process, same thing, intentionally buried. So what is going on here? As Klaus Schmidt said, and I'm convinced 100% because I came to the same conclusion independently, looking at the stratigraphy, it was intentionally buried at least by 8,000 BC, 10,000 years ago, if not earlier, probably much earlier than that. And Klaus Schmidt pointed out that in his assessment, and I think he was correct about this, they spent as much time and energy to bury it as they did to construct it in the first place. Now, a different type of energy, covering a site over, filling it in, but still a lot of effort, a lot of energy to do it. So why would you do that? Why would you bother? A lot of the archaeologists, and I don't want to sound the wrong way about my fellow colleagues, academics, a lot of them say, they built it and then part of their ritual was to cover it over again. It's like busy work, you build it, but you cover it over right away again. They literally would say that. I don't believe that's the case. And also, when you look at the site, it's not like the stratigraphy does not say they carved out this pillar and then covered it. They carved out this pillar and covered it, or they built this enclosure and then covered it. No, it apparently was covered over pretty much all at one time. And when were they doing this? 9700 BC. So this brings us to the end of the last ice age, which is something that I have been interested in long before I ever came to Egypt. As a graduate student, I studied this and was interested in it. And my thinking, and the geological community thinking about that end of the last ice age has evolved over the last few decades. But to give you just some background information, because this is important, the end of the last ice age. The last ice age was very what? Hot or cold? Come on.
Freezing.
Oh, freezing, yeah, it's an ice age. And glaciers extended lower in the northern hemisphere to lower latitudes, etc. And, you had different fauna and flora. You had woolly mammoths and rhinos and all that type of thing. And the ice ages last roughly 100,000 years. But there's times when it's warmer, it's cooler, warmer within the ice age. But still overall cold cold conditions compared to today. Now, at the end of the last ice age, it began to slowly warm up. It looked like we were coming out of the last ice age. Then there's a cold snap, which begins at 10,900 BC, or BCE, if you like, before the Common Era. 10,900 BC, and the dates are important because there's a cold snap, and that cold snap is considered the beginning of what's known as the Younger Dryas. Do people know what Dryas is?
Flower.
Yeah, it's a flower, exactly. Exactly. A little alpine flower, very good. And so they proliferated then under the colder conditions, so you find a lot of pollen from them. So that's why they call it the Younger Dryas. Why the Younger Dryas? Is there an older Dryas?
Yeah.
Yes. Geologically, there's an older Dryas thousands of years earlier. That's the way geologists think in terms of, they name different periods, just like we talk about the Renaissance or the Victorian period, etc. So the Younger Dryas begins at 10,900 BC, and then at 9,700 BC, there's this incredible warming. And I'll tell you how incredible it is in a few minutes, how fast it occurs.
Careful, it's moving a little. Yeah, that's
I
okay.
don't want to break anything. 9,700 BC. So 10,900 BC to 9,700 BC, that's a period of about how long?
1,200.
1,200 years. 1,200 year colder period when it was even colder than the preceding couple of thousand years. So we're really going back into Ice Age. Then there's a really quick warming snap that we snap out of the Ice Age. This is the official end of the last ice age, geologically. 9,700 BC, which is exactly what time? Göbekli Tepe time. Göbekli Tepe straddles that. And I'm convinced that the snapping of the pillars and knocking them over and trying to reconstruct them, that's all happening within the years around 9,700 BC, based on the stratigraphy, based on the radiocarbon dating. So what's happening here? Here's a little diagram. This is actually from a book I'm a co-author on, environmental science book. This is a logarithmic scale, not a linear scale, but it's showing very cold conditions. This is estimates in degrees centigrade. Very cold conditions during the last ice age. See how it started to warm up? And then it got cold again? That's the Younger Dryas right in there. Then look at the incredible warming. That geologically is incredible. And then since then, climate has gone up and down. It's varied, within
Careful, honey.
Fahrenheit, a couple of degrees, within centigrade, degree or so less. Over time, since the end of the last ice age. And we'll come back to that. Now, you may have heard about some of the theories. Comets. And comets just don't work. And I will say that bluntly. People have heard about comet theories,
Yes.
end of last ice age, etc. Okay, the final cold snap begins at 10,900 BC, 12,900 years ago. Some people, and it's very popular now among certain people in certain groups, that there was a comet that hit the Earth or exploded above the Earth and caused the Earth to go into a cold spell. So that's been suggested. I'm going to tell you right now, comet or a meteorite or an asteroid, as far as I'm concerned, technically has been falsified. That it wasn't, the evidence does not stand up to that. What was it? I believe it was a solar outburst. And I will maybe come to that in a minute, but I'll give you the quick explanation now. How can a solar outburst, the sun exploding? When I say a solar outburst, people know what I'm talking about? I'm talking about the sun essentially exploding, giving off what are known as coronal mass ejections, solar particle events or solar proton events. It ejects material. It has huge flares coming out. It gives off plasma, which is electrically charged particles moving very, very quickly, close to the speed of light, or I should say a significant proportion of the speed of light. When you have electrical charges moving very quickly, they generate a magnetic charge, and this interacts with our planet. It interacts with our magnetosphere. It causes havoc in the atmosphere. It causes havoc in the magnetosphere. It can destroy the ozone layer. This is all, we'll come back to this more later, but it can cause incredible temperature changes and climate changes. And what it does is it tends to warm the climate. So how can that cause a cold snap? Anyone know? Remember at the end, go ahead.
Rapid deglaciation.
Rapid deglaciation. Because remember, at the end of the last ice age, I was mentioning to you, it started to warm up. As it warmed up, glaciers were melting. And what you had, especially in the northern hemisphere, and this has been well known geologically, actually since the 19th century, there were huge glacial lakes. Huge lakes on the glaciers that formed as the glaciers were melting, but they were backed up by ice dams. So they stayed as huge lakes on the glaciers. Everyone follow what I'm saying? And they were blocked by ice dams. If you have a solar event, what will that do? That will melt those ice dams almost instantaneously. It will dump all that water into the ocean, especially in the northern hemisphere, and it can literally change circulation patterns. And the Earth's climate is affected by ocean circulation patterns to a great extent. And this is not just imagination or a hypothesis. In the last few years, physical evidence in terms of microfossils and changes in isotopes, etc., has indicated that at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, 10,900 BC, huge glacial lakes were undammed, flooded virtually instantaneously into the oceans, changed circulation patterns, and caused a cooling spell for 1,200 years. Does that all make sense? So it's counterintuitive, maybe, but a solar event, I'm convinced, is the best explanation for that cooling period of the Younger Dryas. Question?
And just for clarification, you're saying because the water up there was so cold, as it flowed down towards the equator, it cooled things off?
No.
Change the
Partly
circulation
that-
of the water.
But the main thing is that it was fresh water that you get in glaciers. And it was cold, yes, but the main thing was it was so much fresh water and it was dumped so quickly that it changed the circulation patterns, not just because it was cold. Am I making sense?
Yeah, I
I mean, you follow what I'm saying.
I understand what you're saying. The follow-up would be like, what about that would make things so cold? You know?
Louder?
What about
Oh,
fresh
because
water makes
what
things cold?
what it does is it actually reversed some of the circulation patterns in the Atlantic in particular. And when you look at something like England, which is fairly far north, we have certain circulation patterns now that brings fresh, warm water from the equator north, and those were reversed because of this. Does that make sense?
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it through especially the northern hemisphere continents, the high latitudes, into a temporary cold situation for some 1,200 years. Am I making sense?
And
Just
you
follow what I'm saying? And also, you have to realize, as a geologist, people think about the Younger Dryas as being a cooling period globally, which is semi-true. It was primarily a northern hemisphere phenomenon. Things were a bit different in the southern hemisphere, so it was primarily a northern hemisphere phenomenon, and it was throwing the northern hemisphere into a colder episode quickly enough that, yes, it had global implications, but it was not as extreme in the southern hemisphere. A very slight temperature change in the southern hemisphere, but very much so in the northern hemisphere. I don't know if I'm explaining it well enough.
You are.
Yes. Comment, question.
So it's like yes, they melted, but it set off this momentum.
Yeah.
That lasted 1,200
Yeah.
years.
It
circulation
set up a
changed.
momentum, and actually, if you look at, there are not just circulation patterns on the surface or close to the surface, but the deep ocean circulation patterns. It was primarily the
The
very
warm
deep
water
ocean
was not
circulation
getting-
patterns that were affected and changed. And it takes a long time for those to restore themselves. If that makes some sense. So I'm convinced, and just so you know, I'm not making things up. I'm not pushing books, but I talk about this in the new edition of Forgotten Civilization and cite. I'm just getting blinded by the sun. I cite the references for this work because I was for a long time confused as to what could happen. Because the traditional view, to put in context, the traditional view is it must be a comet. Why? Because a comet could cause theoretically a cooling effect, because theoretically a comet would throw up all kinds of dust and debris into the atmosphere to cause a cooling effect, but there's really no evidence for that. No crater was found for it. Then they were saying, well, the craters must have been on ice. Well, that would eliminate the dust and debris. I'll get to you in 2 seconds. Then they said, oh, there's a comet. Where was it? Greenland, I think, the Hiawatha crater. And that must be the end of the Younger Dryas. It turns out that crater is now known to be over 50 million years old. It doesn't have anything to do with it whatsoever. So it was really perplexing until this most recent data came through that, yes, there was this massive release of water. I mean, we're talking really massive because you had huge glacial lakes that covered much of North America and dumped it into the oceans of the Northern Hemisphere. A couple of questions.
You said the ozone layers were affected.
Absolutely. Ozone layers affected, so you'd have high radiation levels on Earth. Well, I'll come back to that. It was really tumultuous.
Yeah, because if an ozone layer is affected, it's just the north side of the layer. Those ozone layers would go as a whole.
Oh, it would be affected globally for that. That would be a global
So
phenomenon.
how the north is more affected by south?
The North was more affected than the South because the huge glacial lakes were primarily in the Northern Hemisphere. And if you look at the distribution of continents and where the glaciers were at the end of the last ice age, it was primarily a Northern Hemisphere phenomenon. And then that's what was affected primarily. So it has to do with the distribution of land and ice. A question there.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say it sounds like some of this has maybe already been researched. We don't know the rest of your talk. Ice core experiments,
Ice core?
ice core experimentation
Yeah.
to go to help to create an answer.
Oh, yeah. A lot of this is based on ice cores. Greenland ice cores have been absolutely essential for figuring out what's going on.
It's
Absolutely essential for what's going on to figure out this scenario. So I'm going to end in 2 minutes because I see Max standing there and telling me that I have to end. But I want to leave a good breaking point. So this cold snap occurred globally, but primarily Northern Hemisphere. Then you had this dramatic warming 1,200 years later, and essentially what happened is you had another major solar outburst, but at that point, you don't have the glaciers and the glacial ice. You have some glaciers still, but you don't have these huge glacial lakes, is what I'm trying to say. And it had a very different effect. It had more the effect that most people would think of intuitively for a solar outburst, which was a warming effect. Everyone with me? So a lot of it has to do with what are the conditions on Earth at any particular time, and when you have an event like this, what is it going to create? What is it going to cause? And yeah, in fact, there's been a lot of evidence that it wasn't impact, and in fact, a lot of data is coming out that it wasn't an impact, and that you can explain the data otherwise. I'll get to that in part 2 tomorrow. And I want to plant the seed right now. Some of the data for a quote meteor or comet is good data. But in my assessment, it's better explained by a solar outburst because you can explain the same data either way. Other data, frankly, is wrong because the mineralogy has been misidentified. So the types of what they call nanodiamonds have been misidentified. And then there's evidence I'll show you tomorrow that cannot be explained, as far as we know, by a comet or asteroid, but does fit a solar outburst. So in my assessment right now, all the evidence best fits solar outbursts at the beginning and end. And I do want to say I was never opposed to comets inherently because in some of my earlier work, like Voyages of the Pyramid Builders or Voices of the Rocks, I actually predicted that there might be cometary impacts at that time. And I'd love to be able to say, oh, I was right, I predicted that, but you have to follow the evidence. And I don't believe the evidence stands up to that right now. And that's, even if I'm contradicting my earlier self, I try to follow the evidence. And so we're going to talk next time about the sun, part 2, and how the sun fits in, and we'll get back to more. We'll revisit this and we'll talk about it in more detail. That make sense? Yeah. Okay, so that's it now. So thank you very much. I'm going to continue just a little bit of overlap to get us caught up. And where I left off, remember, I was talking about Göbekli Tepe and the intentional burial of Göbekli Tepe. And just to remind you, when they were burying Göbekli Tepe, they did not just let it fall down and collapse with the catastrophes at the end of the last ice age. But remember how they took pillars and they put them back into position. So apparently the positioning them was very important. It was very important that they get back in the right alignments, the right positions. And notice how this is a secondary wall. Remember that? That's put up against it. So they positioned them. They put in these secondary walls. You can see how this broke. The top is missing here. You can see here how they did the same thing with repositioning them. So they did this very carefully. Then they buried the entire site. Now, people argue about when the site was ultimately filled up. It may have taken some time. So I'm going to get into the solar outburst that I am convinced brought the last ice age to an end. But something I want to mention right now, because some of us were talking about it, is that you would have had, I believe, based on the astrophysics, a few smaller solar outbursts than the big one that brought the ice age to an end in 9700 BC. But the data indicates the sun doesn't just undergo a big solar outburst and then stop. There would have been smaller ones after that for a while until it stabilized. I'm a geologist. Think of an earthquake. What do you have before earthquake, a major earthquake? Foreshocks. You have little earthquakes leading up to it. You usually have the big earthquake, and then you have aftershocks. And very much the same thing when you have a star that undergoes these changes. So the whole site was buried, as Klaus Schmidt said, intentionally buried. They spent a lot of time and energy doing this, and this ties in with what was happening at the end of the last ice age. And you remember from last time that at the end of the last ice age, we had this cooling period known as the Younger Dryas that lasts from about 10,900 BC to 9,700 BC. What's that based on? What are those dates based on? Anyone remember?
Greenland ice core?
Ice cores.
Oh, look at that. Hey.
It's ready. It's ready.
Already? Yeah, so what's that based on? Ice core data.
No, it's not
Very
working.
good. Ice core data, especially Greenland ice core.
It's not on.
Not working. What do I do here? Whoop. 1, 2, 3,
Yeah,
4.
now you're
Now
working.
it's working. Okay, so based on ice core data, everyone here back? Yeah, based on ice core data. And so this is actually very precise. When I say very precise, once in a while, they count back literally, it's like tree rings. But what happens in Greenland ice core data and the Antarctic ice core data, is you have summers and winters. So it actually forms layers, and you can see the annual layers. So it's very, very precise. And when they say it's very precise, there are the people who specialize in this tend to be confident that they're within maybe 5 years or so of a true date of 9 calendar years. So 9700 BCE, 10,900 BCE are very precise dates. Now, just as a side note, sometimes you'll see in the older literature, they'll say 10,800 or 9,500 for the latter date. We're talking about the same thing. I once had someone say to me, "Oh, you're wrong. No, it's 9,500 BC." No, he was basing it on the older literature, which is now outdated. And you remember this graph I showed you, how we had the warming trend, then it cooled suddenly for 1,200 years and then warmed up again. So what caused this? As I was saying, and I'm going to go into this more detail, not a comet, not a meteor, not an asteroid. I'm convinced that's not the case. But you did have Göbekli Tepe. You had the origins of the Great Sphinx, not the head, because that's much later. That's recarved. But you have evidence of this earlier, what I call cycle of civilization, physical evidence at the end of the last ice age, so at 9700 BCE and before. And just to introduce the term for those who might not know it, Katie actually came up with this name, but the solar-induced dark age, after the collapse of this early cycle of civilization, up to the rise or the traditional beginning of civilization, a real reemergence of civilization. So what's happening at these two dates, 10,900 and then 1,200 years later? I am 100% convinced right now, based on the evidence, that it's most probable it was solar events bounding both of them. And I mentioned that really we need to look at the sun. And the sun is not always quiet. It's been relatively stable for several thousand years, 8,000 to 11,000 years. We'll come back to that. It's actually going through a period of instability right now in the last 70 to 100 years, not to scare you. And it was very unstable at the end of the last ice age and through the Younger Dryas. Right now, we always have plasma. Remember plasma, electrically charged particles coming from the sun. That's known as the solar wind. The solar wind that's coming off of it. What does this create? In very high latitudes, you get the auroras. And actually, just recently, some of the auroras went down to lower latitudes because the sun has been relatively active recently. And it goes through a number of cycles, from everything from sunspot cycles, which are on an 11-year basis, up to, we now believe astrophysically, cycles that are on the 10,000 to 13,000 year cycles. And that ties in with the cycle from the end of the last ice age, that we're actually coming to the end of a 10 to 12,000 year cycle. I'll come back to that with incredible activity at the end of the last ice age and ramping up for that now. This is courtesy of NASA. This is diagrammatically the sun, diagrammatically what? The Earth. And this is a magnetosphere around the Earth. And notice how the solar particles, the solar energetic particles, coronal mass ejections, of course, this is not to scale. It hits the Earth, hits the other planets too, and it shapes the magnetosphere. And there's also a heliosphere because the sun itself is magnetic. So it's a lot to do with interacting electrical particles, magnetic fields. Remember from your physics that whenever you have a charged particle moving, it generates magnetic fields, so electromagnetic fields. And the sun is not stable. As I said, the sun sometimes undergoes major solar outbursts, ejects powerful plasma, again, electrically charged particles. And when you have this, it can cause massive destruction on Earth. It can dramatically warm the climate, melt the glaciers, and I am absolutely convinced, I'll show you more evidence for this, that this is what happened at 9700 BC. As I mentioned before, we have ice core data, especially from Greenland, also supplemented by Antarctica, We have sediment core data. A lot of this data has to do with isotopes, chlorine isotopes, carbon isotopes, beryllium isotopes, because what happens when you have these major solar outbursts, you have a stream of particles that hits the atmosphere, and it has what they call a particle cascade. It hits different oxygen and nitrogen, which is primarily what our atmosphere is made of, mostly nitrogen and oxygen. And it causes these particles to change and go into radioactive isotopes. It hits the nuclei. I'm not going into particle physics now, but you pick up these particles, radioactive particles, and they're indicators in the sediment cores and the ice cores of when you have these major solar outbursts. Does that make some sense to everyone? So it's actually become very precise in the last 20 years or so that we can get proxies as to when the sun is active. Someone who I have a lot of respect for, he's unfortunately now deceased, was an astrophysicist, Thomas Gold. He was a prize-winning astrophysicist, and it's interesting, he started talking about this in the 1960s. And this is a quote from him in the 1960s. And people basically said he was crazy at the time because, we know the sun is very stable. It wouldn't do anything like this. It turns out he was absolutely right in foretelling that this would be the case. So this is a quote from him. In the case of a big solar outburst, the Earth's magnetic field could clearly not hold up the incoming gas. He's referring to the charged particles. They didn't call it plasma at that time. And it would indeed drive down to the atmospheric level. And he said it would take the form of a series of sparks, or you could think of huge lightning bolts in certain regions coming down, literally touching the surface of the Earth. And that a series of sparks, came back to his quote, burning for extended periods of time and carrying currents of hundreds of millions of amperes. And he said this would cause massive destruction on the surface of the Earth. And one thing he said you should look for is what? Vitrification on the surface of the Earth. And remember, I already showed you what I believe is vitrification right on the Giza Plateau. And getting back to something else they were talking about yesterday, and I started to introduce, I'm convinced that both the beginning of the Younger Dryas and the end of the Younger Dryas are bounded by solar events, and Göbekli Tepe spans especially this period. But in fact, Klaus Schmidt, before he passed away, and I'm convinced of this independently, thought that Göbekli Tepe, once it's all excavated and other sites around it, would span the entire Younger Dryas. So these were people that were seeing what was happening both in 10,900 BC, and then their descendants 1,200 years later had a concept of this too. So they may have seen things in the sky, that sun was starting to misbehave, if you would, and they knew it was coming, maybe from having their ancestors having experienced it previously. Then we can think about that. This I want to mention. This is a colleague of mine, Dr. Paul LaVioletta. Katie and I went to visit with him actually, last summer? Yeah, and interviewed him for the Oracle documentary that we're working with the not-for-profit Oracle on it. And he came out back in 2011, and people thought this was really radical. He developed the data based on sediment cores, in this case, primarily sediment cores, supplemented by ice cores, that there was a huge, what he called a solar proton event, a type of solar outburst that occurred at the beginning of the Younger Dryas. So he developed independent evidence that that's what occurred. Again, at that time, a lot of people said, well, how could a solar event throw us into a cold period for 1,200 years? And that was actually very puzzling for Dr. LaViolette and for me and for other people thinking about this. And as I mentioned yesterday, it was I want to get that right, 2018, that I think another piece of research really broke that open. And this was about the declacial floods. Remember I talked about the floods that were the big lakes that were developing on the tops of the continents. And it was this paper with Keegan et al., where they, and this is their term, that's why I put it in quotes, they talked about glacial lake outbursts. And I thought that was interesting because we're talking about solar outbursts and they're talking about glacial lake outbursts, that those dams broke and put all this water, fresh water, into the oceans and the Atlantic in particular. And I think it's only solar activity, or it's solar activity. It must have done this, melting the ice dams and the glaciers. It changed the circulation patterns. And I don't think I used the term yesterday, but a lot of people have heard of the Gulf Stream. So what the Gulf Stream is it's a flow of basically surface water. When I say surface water, we're still talking good depth from a human point of view, but a big circulation of surface water that comes from the southern hemisphere and the tropics, goes up to the northern hemisphere, brings heat, changes the climate, then sinks, and then the cold water circulates down. So sometimes I think of it as a big conveyor belt. And the evidence based on foraminifera and other microorganisms and the oxygen isotopes, which give you the temperature changes because different types of oxygen are used preferentially by these microorganisms depending on the temperature. So it gives you the temperature, and they could see the change in circulation and the change in temperature from this outburst. When I say outburst now, glacial lake outburst at 10,900 BCE. And apparently the Gulf Stream really stalled, or they think maybe literally stopped for a number of centuries. So that would change the whole pattern of warm heat. Well, I shouldn't say heat, warm water, heat on the surface of the earth. Right now, if the Gulf Stream stopped, what would happen to Britain? What would happen to Britain? It'd be really cold, etc. And that's apparently what was happening back then. Have you ever heard The Day After Tomorrow? Katie pointed this out to me. This is a movie sort of based on that concept, which came out before the actual evidence. Yeah, it was all hypothetical back then. It was just speculation. Now we have evidence that that type of thing happened. But what I'm really interested in is not the beginning of the Younger Dryas, but the end of the Younger Dryas, the end of the last ice age. When I was a graduate student, we talked about the ice age ending very quickly, and we were thinking, oh, very quickly would be 2 centuries, 3 centuries. Then this paper came out, which was really pivotal, and I don't want you to try to read it just to show that's real. Really pivotal based on the Greenland ice cores, that high-resolution Greenland ice core data show abrupt climate change happens in just a few years. I mean, that was absolutely amazing that the ice age ended in just a couple of years, less than 10 years, less than a decade. If I had talked about that as a graduate student at Yale when I was a graduate student, they say you're absolutely crazy. They'd probably kick me out or something for being so radical. But here we have the data. But it gets better. Then later, more work. Now, this to me is really key. What you're looking at, I'm just going to spend a couple of seconds. This is really high resolution data from the Greenland ice cores from Greenland. And this came out, the initial work came out in 2014, it's being even refined since. You see these? From here to here to here to here to here to here. Each one of those is 1 year. That's how good the resolution is. So this is going from older to younger. You see Younger Dryas there. This is Holocene. That's a geological name for post-ice age. So this is 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. This is the first year of post-ice age. This is the last year of the ice age. This black bar there, that is when the ice age ended. It's not even, it doesn't even take a year. It takes a fraction of a year. That's probably, a couple of weeks. And that's the best resolution we can get. That doesn't mean it actually took 2 weeks or 3 weeks. All the evidence is it literally happened like that overnight. Am I making sense? So, this is real data. And what can cause something to happen like that overnight? I think the only thing we have conceivably right now, and of course I'm always open to other possibilities if anyone comes up with evidence for it, but a solar outburst. The sun will do that really quickly. Am I making sense? Yeah. Yeah. If you start thinking in terms of, oh, the ocean circulation patterns change or something like that, it would not happen that quickly. It would lead up to it slowly. We have this dramatic change. I mean, literally overnight. Getting back to Thomas Gold. Remember Thomas Gold? He suggested this back in the 1960s and people laughed at him. Literally. He pursued it further. He first talked about it in about 1962. 1969. This is a paper he published in 1969 because what did America do in 1969? They went to Apollo. They went to the moon. And he found evidence. This is his abstract. I love this short abstract. Some glazing is apparently due to radiation heating. It suggests a giant what? Solar outburst in geologically recent times. Read that geologically recent times. He's talking end of the last ice age. Back then, it was dated. People didn't know the exact dating. And I remember even as a grad student, we just talked in terms of, about 10,000 years ago, because we didn't have the Greenland ice cores to get precisely. But he found that. And what he found, when he says glazing, what's our term for it now? Vitrification. He found vitrification on the moon at that time. This is really important. When you have a solar outburst, if the moon is hit, what else will be hit? Earth, because we're so close together. And he found the evidence on the moon initially. It's also important because on the moon, you have very little what? Atmosphere. So it's not weathering away, so it's much more easily preserved. So actually some of the best early evidence came from the moon. This is, I have mentioned this before, isn't it beautiful? To geologists, it's about that big, right, Kate?
Yeah.
And this is from the Geological Museum in Cairo. This is an example of the Libyan desert glass, which again, people have usually said, oh, it had to be a comet or an asteroid, that type of thing. This covers 2,500 square kilometers. It's not totally covered like a sheet of glass, but pieces of it, the strewn field, as it's called. You don't get that with a comet. No crater's been found. No definitive meteoritic evidence has been found. Perfect, I think, evidence of a solar outburst. This is another one. I like this one too, because this is even more definitive or more typical, should we say, from a geological point of view. Does this look like what I showed you at the Giza Plateau? Yeah. This is from known as the Dockley glass from Western Desert. These are centimeters, just if you are interested in scale. But you see how it's glass in the crude sense, natural glass where the rock was flash melted, bubbled, and then congealed again. And again, most people traditionally have said this must be due to a what? A comet. But there's no evidence for a comet. There's no impact crater for a comet. This one is not quite as big an area, only 400 square kilometers, but that's plenty. And you get that. Now, tying in with that, when you have, and some of you know this because we talked about, when you have modern lightning hitting the rock, it melts it and it recongeals, and that's known as fulgurites. These Dockley glass, Libyan desert glass, and other glasses like that, I contend, and I'm not the only one, that those are fulgurites. I mean, they're basically strewn fields, but not from atmospheric lightning, but from a solar outburst. Everyone with me? And this is a paper, it was actually a thesis that was done on modern fulgurites. More or less, you can see where the lightning hits, and you know the lightning hit there. You can get the fulgurite in the present day, so there's no question that was caused by lightning. And this is just one example of a number of papers that are coming out now where people are analyzing the fulgurites and the lightning strikes and finding that all the characteristics that some people thought could only be from comets and meteors and asteroids you're finding, even with atmospheric lightning, much less if you had even more powerful similar phenomena like a solar outburst. And I'm not going to read all of this to you, but in this paper, Michael Joseph, who wrote it, even talks about the Dockley glass and putative. So my possible putative impact glass characteristics are all observed within the, in his case, 11 Fulbright samples that he examined. So all this data coming out. Here, another one, just to show you there's real science behind it. Generation of Schoch lamellae, which everyone always thought had to be from comets and asteroids. You're finding that in rocks hit by lightning. It induces the same type of shock features. So I think it's very, very strong evidence just to show, I guess, somewhat younger me, but this, for instance, is vitrification. I have only in my hand. Does it look similar to what we saw? And this is well-known vitrification at the Motive Mark in Scotland. There's just some pictures of it. Isn't it pretty? Coming to a geologist,
Yes.
it's pretty. And we even have, as you know, history of being struck by lightning and plasma at the Sphinx. And we went, does that look familiar? We went to the Isis, Temple of Isis, and we were right there. And something that was found there is known as the inventory stela. And I did not see the inventory stela when we were in the museums. They may have moved it since that used to be in the Pink Museum, the Cairo Museum. But there's the inventory stela, which is, absolutely like period. But it does talk about the Sphinx being hit by a thunderbolt or lightning. I'll read this. This is from Salim Hassan, one of the great, in my opinion, great Egyptologists of the last century. He wrote this in a little book that was published actually by the Egyptian government. The Sphinx, its history in the light of recent excavations. This is 1949. But if we could believe, so his writing, quote from him, if we could believe its inscriptions, that's of the inventory stela, we should have to credit Khufu with having repaired the Sphinx. But Khufu, by traditional dates, was before the Sphinx, not after. Apparently after it had been hit by a thunderbolt. As a matter of fact, there may be a grain of truth in this story, where the tail of the Nemes headdress is certainly missing. There is actually to be seen on the back of the Sphinx the scar of this breakage. Therefore, it is perhaps likely that the Sphinx was struck by lightning. Now, to break that rock, you're talking pretty powerful lightning. Not your typical, I would say as a geologist, not your typical atmospheric thunderstorm. But there's not a particle evidence to show that this accident happened in the reign of Khufu. I actually agree with him. Not a particle of evidence. Well, I don't think it happened during the reign of Khufu. I think it happened much, much earlier. He's suggesting later, of course. But I just throw that out, provocative, let you think about. And that should look familiar. Yeah, we were there. And there's a picture, you saw that. And you saw that there, remember?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, there I am again. Katie, yeah. Pictures that. So aside from the isotopes and cores, sediment cores, the lunar data, the vitrification, we also have other evidence. And this gets into some of the evidence that there's no way, in my assessment, to explain it as a comet or a meteor, but it does tie in with solar outbursts. And this is work done by various plasma physicists, but the leading figure is Dr. Anthony Perrott of the Los Alamos National Laboratory. I first met him around 2000, so 20-some years ago. I actually, true story, I thought it was this is wild and crazy stuff, and I couldn't take it very seriously at the time just because I had my own preconceptions. But as we've seen it, and as I've done my own research, I see how it ties in. And he's demonstrated around the world the ancient petroglyphs going back to the time of the end of the last ice age, found all over the world, are indicative of exceptional plasma phenomena. They would see things in the sky during a major solar outburst. And remember the aurora borealis or the aurora australis, the northern and southern lights? They look sort of diffuse and they're pretty shapes and they sort of look like maybe a curtain in the sky. But when you have stronger streams of particles coming from the sun during a solar outburst, what now sometimes is referred to as a micronova, has now been found. This was first suggested, and the astrophysicists said, oh, this is crazy. But now they found that stars can, in some cases, undergo micronovae, where the star isn't destroyed by it, but it throws off a shell of electrically charged particles, a stream in all directions. So if it's in all directions, does that mean the planet cannot escape it? Any planet that's orbiting around the sun. Sometimes you have a coronal mass ejection that's just in one direction. There was one, what was it, in 2012, where it went out in one direction. We were in our orbit. If it had been 2 weeks different, we would have been right in the middle of the stream. And we wouldn't be here today, I guarantee you, because it would have destroyed, modern civilization. But not to scare anyone, but if you have a micronova, it goes in all directions simultaneously. So in some cases, that may be what's happening in the past. But he found these shapes, and what's happening is that charged particles are coming in, they're spinning around each other because of electromagnetic field, and then when you view it, it takes on shapes. And you see how that sort of looks like a stick figure man with dots on the side? Well, real humans don't have dots on their sides. They don't take on these shapes. And he was absolutely amazed, again, to remind you of the borealis aurora. So this is sometimes known as a sprite, which is not even close to as powerful as what we're talking about for the end of the last ice age. But do you see how it starts to take on the type of shape? Okay, so it's harder. Everyone sees sort of like a figure like that. This is a very mild effect. If we had nice photos of really good ones, again, we wouldn't be talking right now because it would have brought us down. But he started looking at this. This again shows you what it looks like. And what he found is that depending on the angle and how the particles come in, etc., you get different diagnostic shapes. And some of them sort of look like stick figures. Some of them look like, you see what that looks like? A bird?
Yeah.
So it gives birds, sort of stick figures with birds' heads.
Isn't that from his laboratory? He also demonstrated in the laboratory.
Yes. Okay, I should point out that he's at Los Alamos and he does these actual experiments where and he's described it as how, it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to run one experiment. So if you think of super colliders, that type of thing, it's sort of a similar type of situation. And he said how, it's underground and they have this big tunnel and it has to all be shielded with lead, and everyone, I think he said they literally have to be a mile away, everyone, because the radiation is so high, and they shoot it onto steel plates and have cameras that can capture these images. So these are actually experimental images. These are then conceptuals, with the computer looking at it. And the same thing here, various simulations and experiments, and you get these different shapes. Am I making sense a little bit? So 3 of the major diagnostic shapes, they sort of look like stick figure men with dots on their sides. Some look like stick figure men with birds' heads. Remember the concept of birdmen? I think part of that goes back to this early period because it impressed people. This would have really made an impression for seeing these things in the sky. And then cascading donut-like cylindrical shapes. And not only are you seeing them in the sky, but at the same time, you're having incredible effects on Earth. So catastrophic effects on Earth. And he has found these. This is from his work. He's found these around the world in over 130 countries. So, I think it defies comprehension to think that simultaneously, at the end of the last ice age, people were just carving these things into rocks because they all decided that they were going to carve weird-looking, sort of human-type things with dots on their sides without there actually being a reason to do it. Am I making sense? Yeah, they were seeing things in the sky. And furthermore, without going into a lot of detail here, he has been able to determine that, okay, they're carving on this canyon wall and the line of sight where it must have been. And he's finding that different parts of the world, all the lines of sight aim toward the same part of the globe. So that was where the plasma was coming in during that solar outburst. So there's a lot of detail here. And you get, we love these, Katie and I love these. You see these here with the birds' heads, sort of stick figures with birds' heads, which I think is very diagnostic, and then with the dots, etc. Here's more they found. Sometimes you get numerous forms, and then these turn into cylindrical shapes. Again, the basic theme, and then variations on it. Here's more to show you, and let's see. There's some more. I like that one particular stick figure with the bird's head, but you get these all just consistently. These are some that we looked at. When I say we, Katie and I, when we went to Norway, I gave some presentations there, was invited, and I said, I'll come under the condition that you go and let me look at some of the petroglyphs from the end of the last ice age. And there they are, same patterns, same diagnostic shapes. This also gets into Easter Island. So Easter Island is known, among other things, for the moai. These are the moai, the big heads, which everyone likes. They're quite cute, aren't they? But what's important, and it turns out Perot had studied this also, but not published it. We went there and we were looking at it. Easter Island is this remote little island in the Pacific. That's actually, as we were flying in, I could talk a lot about Easter Island, but we won't do that today, except for one point, which is the petroglyphs and the rongo. So here you have the petroglyphs. You see the Birdman? Yeah, and they elaborate on the whole Birdman theme, and they built a whole cult, if you would, around it. But I think its origins go back to the end of the last ice age and dramatic things that were happening. Here's an old photograph from the 1920s where they would chalk it in so you could see it better. And similarities too, remember? Göbekli Tepe, the positioning of the hands and the navel and the belt. Well, you get similarities in the moai. There's lots of things to explore here. And I couldn't help but put this in. There's, remember, Urfaman? And there's a little basalt moai from Easter Island. Sometimes she's referred to as a female because she's got breasts. But notice the face with the lack of the mouth, etc. I'm not sure what's happening here with the head or the headdress. Just lots of mysteries there. But one of the big mysteries, and Katie gets credit for this, is that Easter Island has an indigenous script known as the Rongo script. And people couldn't figure out what this was. To this day, linguists say it's an undeciphered script, etc., etc. But you see the figures in it? Look at that. And bird-headed men and all these types of things. And Katie had the inspiration that these look a lot like the plasma petroglyphs and plasma experiments that Perot was doing. And we started comparing them, and we feel very strongly that, yes, this is duplicated in the Rongo. And effectively, this is a record of what was happening in the sky at that early period. Now, these tablets, the Rongo tablets, I'll go back for a second. These are on wood. This is actually a plaster cast that they made in the 19th century, so you see it better. These are on wood, so we're not saying that those actual physical tablets are that old, but the Easter Islanders themselves say that they are copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. And in the 19th century, when these were first discovered by Europeans, they were asked, well, what did they say? The Easter Islanders couldn't really explain what they said, but they say it had something to do with the sky and what was happening in the sky. So we think they're copies of copies of copies, just like Plato. Do we have anything written by Plato in his own hand? No. Do we have anything from the 4th century BC? Not really. We have, in some cases, the oldest copies of Plato are only 1,000 or 1,200 years old, but no one doubts that they're real. Does that make sense? So same thing here. And you have in the Rungo all the same forms. And we published this, and lo and behold, someone from Perot's team sent us an email saying that we were absolutely right in their assessment, and they had actually discovered this previously, but had not published it yet. And that they're convinced, as we're convinced, that this may be essentially a scientific text of what happens in the sky during a major solar outburst. So it can actually have very practical value if we can interpret it further, because could this happen again? Absolutely. And we'll come back to that. Just for fun, you have the Rongo. You also remember Nazca? There's a lot of similarities there. This is being inspired by the same phenomena. Katie's even suggested that in some cases it might have literally branded the Nazca plane, and then they marked it out, chalked it out, and used it for ritualistic purposes. Also similarities between the Birdman and what we see at Göbekli Tepe, what we see in other parts in Turkey. This is now in the museum in Urfa, etc. So a lot of similarities, a lot of interesting things. This is interesting too, I think. Anthropologist in 1963, he recorded how the Easter Islanders talked about the Moai. Well, what are they doing? They're gazing up at the sky. He wasn't thinking about solar outbursts or anything else. And he recorded this legend in the days of Roko Hital, which is basically one of the legendary ancient kings of Easter Island, or chiefs of Easter Island. The sky fell. What does that mean? The sky fell. Fell from above onto the earth. The people cried out, the sky has fallen in the days of King Roko Hital. And then he took hold. He waited a given time. The sky returned. It went away and stayed up there. To me, this is a very poetic description of what you would have during a solar outburst. And when we were there, they actually, one of our Easter Island friends and guides, talked about how the Easter Islanders had to go underground for long periods of time. They'd come up to the surface periodically because things were turbulent. We'll come back to that. So there they are looking at the sky. So Dr. Perot and his colleagues published evidence for intense solar outbursts in prehistory. They're not geologists. They didn't have a good sense of the dating, but I have no doubt that this all ties back to the same period, 9700 BC, Göbekli Tepe time. So the evidence suggests that there's this cataclysm, and interestingly, Plato and Atlantis. You know the dating on Atlantis? According to Plato, if you put it into round numbers in our calendar, it's approximately 9600 BC. But he was simply saying 9,000 years, very round number, before Solon. So that would be 9600 BC. I have no doubt that's well within sort of precision that we're talking about for the modern date of 9700 BC. And wiped out the civilizations of that time, so that's why we talk about them having ended the last ice age, going to the solar-induced dark age, and then eventually civilization, to use a modern sort of computer term, rebooting at 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. And when you have a major solar outburst, it could cause all kinds of havoc. It would definitely cause all kinds of havoc where you could melt glaciers, you would release pressure in the crust. We now know that earthquake activity correlates with solar activity for a number of reasons, including I'll call it the avalanche phenomenon, where you have incredible pressure and energy built up, just waiting to be released, sometimes by a very small triggering effect, which we now understand geologically can happen from the sun, from the slight changes in basically the geomagnetic field caused by a solar outburst. You can have deluges of biblical proportions. Why? Because during a solar outburst, it's going to have a heating effect. It's going to melt glaciers, where you have essentially huge lightning bolts hitting glaciers or hitting bodies of water. What's going to happen? It's going to melt the glaciers. It's going to evaporate water. You can only put so much water in the atmosphere before it comes down as torrential rains. So you get the torrential rains, you get the flooding, you have, along with that, rises of sea level. We now know in many areas, 100, 120 or more meters rise in sea levels. It's been calculated. Paul Violetta, who I mentioned before, has calculated how much destruction you would have to the stratospheric ozone, which is basically a major one. You wipe out the ozone layer completely, so you have very high radiation levels, plus the radioactive elements in the atmosphere that are being formed, to the point where large mammals, and keep this in mind as I continue to talk, large mammals exposed to those levels of radiation directly could die within a few days. How do you escape? You have to go under rocks. You have to go underground. So I'll come back to that. Bunkers. Are rich people nowadays, some of them, it's said, building underground bunkers? Do they know something the average person doesn't know? So you have changes in atmospheric pressure, atmospheric circulation patterns, oceanic circulation patterns. Oh, I want to mention with the big rains. What do we have on the Sphinx? I think we have direct evidence of that with this, huge rains and precipitation. You literally have incineration in some areas with the vitrification, and of course, modern civilization. We'd just be gone because of the effects. So, how do you escape from it? How do you survive it? How does anyone survive? You really have to go underground. That's the best thing to do. This is in Cappadocia in Turkey, as an example, one of the numerous underground cities. Hundreds have now been found. It turns out that Cappadocia is a region where it's a volcanic terrain, but it's basically volcanic ash that was laid down and hardened. It's relatively easy to carve into. It would have initially had natural caves, and I believe that's one of the places where humanity literally survived, because they went into a cave, then they could carve further to protect themselves from radiation above. By the best analysis, another friend of mine who's a physicist and astrophysicist, Thomas Brophy, we've talked about this, and by the best calculations, you would, as long as you have maybe 3 meters or more rock above you, that will protect you nicely from the radiation, which would come in bursts. Yeah, it's not continuous. If you're thinking comets or asteroids, wouldn't protect you at all, because these would collapse if it was hit directly. And also, I do want to mention, with a micronova, you can get some physical small impactors. So one does not necessarily preclude the other, but the main thing is solar outbursts. And interestingly, there's been a lot of work. This comes from Proceedings of National Academy of Science, no nonsense journal. Synchronous extinction of North America's Pleistocene mammals, more or less at the end of the last ice age. When does this occur? You have to realize this is what they call uncalibrated, but it occurs right at this period, which is uncalibrated. They call it 10,000. That's 9,700 BC. This is when the extinctions occur, not 1,200 years earlier at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, but right at the end of the Younger Dryas.
Careful,
You
honey.
get.
The thing is moving a little bit.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. I just
Yeah,
don't
I
like
keep
it.
hitting it. This is when you have these mass extinctions and you have this die-off. And what is dying? The top of the food chain, the carnivores, the big animals. Why? Because they can't escape it. Little rats and mice and moles, they are used to living underground. One group that did survive to a certain extent were certain types of bears, because they go into caves. They're used to going into caves, and in some places humans. So it really depends on the animal, depends on the terrain, what could and what could not survive. And this is work by Heinrich and Ingrid Kusch, Austrian archaeologists, biologists. They go into caves and whatnot. And they pointed out that there's this huge passage or underground passages from the end of the last ice age. And you can see how narrow they are. Why would people be carving things like this? It's insane. It's crazy. Except I think, I'm giving you the answer. And this is, look, 12,000 years ago, end of last ice age. I'm not making this up. And you have all these narrow passages. And, other people say, well, how could this be from Scotland to Turkey, etc.? Well, no, it makes sense if you have to go underground for short periods of time to escape from the radiation. I think we now have the answer why you would put all that energy into it.
Does it have to be bedrock to protect you from the radiation?
No, it doesn't need to be bedrock, and that's a really good point. So even fairly bedrock is the best thing. Yes, I will agree with that. But it doesn't need to be super, super dense rock. So, for instance, in Cappadocia, it's a much lighter rock, if I can put it that way in a colloquial sense, than you have in some places. It's not basalt, it's a type of tuff or volcanic ash that's compacted, but that will protect you if you have, a number of meters ahead of you, over you. Things like monumental sculptures, pyramids, etc., will also protect you. Absolutely. If it started to happen right now and we were at the Mina House, I'm serious. Our best bet would be to get into the Great Pyramid. That would protect us. Yeah. That's what you're asking, right?
Yep.
And also, what would survive this the best? Big, monumental, architectural type structures. Yeah. So that's something to think about. Or jump into one of the so-called sarcophagi at the Serapeum. That would help you too.
To what degree, if any, is the magnetic poles impacted by
the magnetic poles are impacted greatly, but we don't know to what degree because it will change and collapse the magnetosphere, etc. It won't necessarily, some people think it'll flip the magnetic poles, but it depends on how the solar outburst comes in, whether it's a directed CME or not. There's a lot of questions here because we haven't experienced one directly in modern times. So there's a lot of speculation. But if you have a magnetic field coming in, it's going to overpower potentially the Earth's magnetic field. And depending on how it comes in and the polarities, just like little magnets, think of little bar magnets and how they can push each other around. That could happen. So it could actually flip the poles. And the Earth has a major dipole, but it also has a number of smaller poles that are associated with that. So it gets to be a very complex situation. And that's different, just to anticipate something that's going through anyone's head, that's different than flipping the spin axis. That's a different thing versus the magnetic field.
And is there any research that indicates the flipping or changing, even for short periods of time, the spin axis is a function of the radiation? I'm looking into that right now, and I'm not convinced that you would have a lot of change in spin axis, but even a couple of degrees of spin axis change is going to have major effects on the surface. So work with Charles Hapgood.
Yeah, that's a different thing, because he's talking about crustal displacement, and we could talk about that. We could talk about that later. Yeah. Okay, same. I got to move ahead. But yeah, these are all really good things that we can discuss further. So you get the point. And around the world, this is in England, you find these mysterious little caves and shelters. I didn't mean to go that fast. There I am, coming out of England. In Easter Island, not only do you have caves, lava tube caves, but they built these weird things, which would make perfect bunkers or fallout shelters. And I think a lot of these were built, or the tradition was started to build them because of what happened at the end of the last ice age. And once you have them, do you use them for other things? Sure. Does that make sense? Or if you have a tradition that this happened to your ancestors, you maybe prepare for the future in case it happens again? Yes. So I think in some cases, these may be later than the end of last ice age, but they're part of that tradition. In some cases, I think they really go back to that period, not just on Easter Island, but elsewhere. So Easter Island, I love Easter Island. Here is some of the caves. This is on Easter Island, and there we're going into one of these lava tube caves. Can you see how it's a lava tube? But then they would modify them with this artificial bench, if you would. They know that people lived in them. Why do you do that? I think because of exactly what we're talking about. And I'm coming out of it. See how small the entrance is? Well, that's what you want to do if you want to protect from radiation, etc. You have a small, narrow, sort of winding entrance. Then it opens up into the big cave. So this is, in this case, a lava tube cave, but they put a lot of effort into closing up the entrance to just a very small area.
We were all watching as he wiggled his way out of that one.
Yeah. Oh, it was hard on my back. And so we have things like, building under cliffs. Again, this would protect you. This would protect you under such circumstances. Or we went to Malta. One of the most fascinating things in Malta, besides the carpets for me, was they were very proud that their ancestors at one point, back at the end of the last ice age, they lived in caves. Why did they live in caves? And they artificially built up, see how they're protecting the entrance, etc. Yeah. And we have a junta carved into the cliff face. Does this look familiar?
Isn't that basalt? You told me
This
that.
is all basalt. This is really hard to carve. The classic view is, a bunch of monks carved it. I don't think it's just a bunch of monks carving it. I think it was used much earlier, and then it was reused. It was recarved and modified for other purposes. And so it's beautiful, and you can see how the columns have been recarved. Does that look sort of familiar? Just things we've seen here in Egypt?
What was it, Benny?
The same concept, the same idea. There I am looking out, not falling off the cliff. And inside. And yes, it's been recarved, and you've added the Buddhist and whatnot motifs. But that doesn't mean the origins are from that. I think it goes back much earlier, the origins. And then the classic area, at least for us, is Cappadocia in Turkey, which Katie and I just love. Egypt, of course, we love Egypt, but we love Turkey too. Don't make me choose. And you can fly over it in balloons. Just take the balloon, and you can see how they carved into the cliff faces, and they have this long tradition of living in the stone. And then the underground cities like Kamakali, where you go down into it. This is our friend Suat, who is a official guy, just like Muhammad is official guy in Egypt. He's an official guy in Turkey. And you go down 8 or more stories, perfect ventilation, incredibly sophisticated. And some of these could hold 10,000 or more people. It's been calculated and this is the standard archaeological story calculated. And why? What's the standard story? I'll give you the standard story. They were going down to escape their enemies. That's one of the standard stories. Now, interestingly, if you were going down to escape your enemies, could your enemies just sort of lock you in there and starve you out and suffocate you? Yes. But how would they find the underground city? Easy, because do you know how much rock was brought out of these underground cities? There'd be huge piles of rock on the surface to say, here we are. And then you just find it and you block the vents and you block the passages going down. Crazy idea. But you don't find the huge rubble piles. Why? I'm convinced these go back so far in time that that's dissipated, that's eroded away. And yes, there's plenty of evidence that these were used in Christian times, etc. To me, that doesn't mean they originate at that point. Does that make sense? So again, when we're there, some of you are coming to Turkey, and I'd love for all of you to come. Because I still think it's sort of part of the bigger story that we're talking about here in Egypt. You can see places where you can see the layers of plaster, just like here in some cases, and the layers of painting, etc. How these were used and reused over and over. There's just a diagram showing it.
Go back.
just some pictures going through it, and we believe the evidence indicates that here in the Cappadocia region, not far from Göbekli Tepe, there was a pocket of people that survived because of the terrain, because they had the ability to go under. And I want to show you some totally independent evidence. This came out in the journal Science, one of the top-notch journals. And this is mapping the origins and expansion of the Indo-European language family. And what they did is analyze all these different Indo-European language families. And they found that when you do that, you can find that they go back to a common origin. This is their time frame. And essentially, they go back to a common origin temporally at the end of the last ice age and geographically Turkey. Right where we're talking about. And then you can map how the language families spread out. Just like you think of a genetic family, the mother and the father and then all the descendants. Same thing. So to me, this is very strong independent evidence that, yes, a population survived there, then spread out again over the last 12,000 years. Now, a good question, of course, is if we have Siddha, that period of the solar-induced dark age, what were people doing at that time? It was a pauper population because people died off in certain regions, but other people hung on, including in Turkey specifically. So this is some evidence from Turkey. This is known as Çatalhöyük, archaeological site that was discovered in the last century, and everyone was very excited about it at the time. This was discovered long before Göbekli Tepe was discovered, but it is 2,000 to 3,000 years younger than Göbekli Tepe by the standard conventional thinking that at least I grew up with in graduate school and undergraduate school. If it's younger, it should be more or less advanced. More advanced. It's not. It lacks the megalithic structures. It lacks the sophistication. It's a throwback, the Dark Age. And what you get there is just a lot of sort of mud brick type structures. They find little figurines. But I'm convinced this is the Dark Age, the solar-induced Dark Age, civilization decline. And this is not cherry picking. I show you this as one example from this period, but all of the archaeological sites that have been found from this period, a few thousand years after Göbekli Tepe, show the same advances. Klaus Schmidt himself talked about how the Göbekli Tepe people somehow just disappeared, that you don't see consistent traces of them later. And then this is what you see. The height of sophistication here were these plaster walls on the mud brick. And they built over and over on top of each other. So it's really interesting site. There, Katie and I are. Like I said, this represents a solar-induced dark age. So there's all this evidence of, I think, of what happened then. I feel very strongly, in some ways, it would have been nice if it was a comet because I had predicted that earlier, but I was wrong. It was the sun. You have the solar-induced dark age, then you have a re-emergence of civilization.
Robert,
Yeah.
On that screen, can you overlay or have you overlaid where the worldwide various flood myths fit in?
Yes and no, because the worldwide flood myths, this is a temporal scale, and the flood myths have been dated all kinds of by different techniques and by counting backwards with the Bible and that type of thing. But I'm actually convinced that they all have their origins at the end of the last ice age. So my quick answer, and we could talk about that in more detail, but my quick answer is I think they actually all go back to the end of that last ice age, and then some of them were supplemented by later floods, like in the Baltic and the Mediterranean, etc. But I think this actually ties in with something I may have mentioned to all of us, but I know I spoke to some people about it. A Harvard professor, Michael Witzel, 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 off the top of my head, he published a book on the origins of the world's mythologies, which itself is a very controversial book. Why? Because he thought that you see similarities literally around the world in the quote mythologies and traditions, and they all come from a common source, which he places before and at the end of the last ice age, which is very much, keeping with my thinking, but totally independent. Again, another totally independent line of evidence. So my quick answer is that I think the vast majority go back to this period. And I want to point out that since I published Forgotten Civilization in 2012, the first edition, and then a new edition in 2021, in the first edition, we didn't have any of this data. We're now finding that, yes, there was this major solar outburst at the end of the last ice age, 9700 BC, but people are now looking at tree rings and ice cores, etc., and finding that the sun, even since the end of the last ice age, has not been very stable, and there have been major events from a human point of view, astrophysically more minor, but any of these events, if they had occurred, or if they occurred right now, they would bring our civilization down. And it's now been found, and I'm sort of, I don't want to say proud, I'm pleased that since my first edition came out, everyone said, oh, it's a little bit crazy, like Thomas Gold was a little crazy. No, we're finding the sun really is unstable. So just a few of them, 5480 BC, there was a major excursion, anomalies in the sun, 800 BC, 800 BC, 660 BC. A big one occurred in 774, 775, known as a Charlemagne event, because that's from the time of Charlemagne, the famous Charlemagne. This one in particular was pretty extensive. Not what happened at the end of the last ice age, orders of magnitude less than that, but orders of magnitude more than anything we've seen in modern times. Again, would bring down our civilization. Another one, 993, 94. There was been others since then. So could this happen again? We may be overdue, and we may be ramping up. Thomas Gold, who I mentioned before, he thought roughly, and I think he was pretty accurate here, he thought it would probably occur around every 10,000 or so years. And that was a crude estimate. If he's right, 10,000 years, are we overdue? Because it's been almost 12,000 years. This was published in Nature. Again, this is really high quality work. It doesn't get published in Nature if it's not. Solanke et al. And they talked about how the sun is now ramping up in recent decades. This was published in 2004. After a period of 11,000 years of being relatively dormant, relatively stable. So it's coming. Now, this one I want you to look at. This is also from the same general group, Solanke and Usoskin, who are astrophysicists doing now a lot of work on this. And this was published in Astronomy and Astrophysics. And this is the end of the last ice age. What this is solar activity above the red line is really active, below is really dormant. But what's important here is the sun is like misbehaving, it's very unstable. So it goes through periods of incredible activity, then it goes into a lull, then activity again. This is not what you want if you're on a planet around a star. You want something stability. You don't want this up and down mood swings to be anthropomorphic. But that's what's happening at the end of the last ice age. And then notice how this sun, and this is from isotope data, notice how the sun sort of calms down. This is dates. So by 6000 BC, it's starting to calm down again and goes into a relatively stable period. And then by 3000, 4000 BC, it's stable enough. I think this is affecting humans, that civilization reemerges under those more stable conditions. And then everything's been fine and dandy until very recently. See what's happening again? We're now going through that period again. And I'm convinced that as a crude estimate, our star, the sun, goes through periods of instability lasting on the order of maybe 2,000 or so years, and then periods of relative stability, maybe about 10,000 or so years, very round number. And unfortunately, we're coming to the end of that most recent period of stability, and we better be concerned. Better be warned. It's a good thing you're seeing Egypt now and not next, because who knows what will happen next year. So that's what's happening. I think that's important. And the Mayans should be warning us, etc. Now I want to but continue a little bit because we're in Egypt. Because I think a lot of the ancient people, they had a concept of bigger picture, bigger temporal picture, and they kept track of cycles for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. I believe we see that here in Egypt. We see that with the Göbekli Tepe. Remember I was talking about precessional changes? And I think that they understood things about the sun, and this gets back to, remember I mentioned the concept of sacred science, integrating science and spirituality, and we saw even when we were in Middle Egypt, how the sun was taken so seriously by Akhenaten, but it's been taken seriously by all of ancient Egyptian civilization. And there's a spiritual aspect to the sun and its energies too. So I just wanted to digress on that a little bit, or mention a little bit about this. This should look familiar. Horus are the Birdman, and Birdman type figures. I don't know if you saw this in the Cairo Museum. Katie and I saw it when we were last there. I love it. It's Greco-Roman by a bird woman. And there, remember, I'm reminding you about the plasma petroglyphs and how I think some of this may have been derived. This actually I can suggest that comes from a plasma configuration, initially the Ankh, which turned into the Christian cross, etc. Yes, I know there was a crucifixion, but I think, many symbols can take on multiple meanings and have diverse significance for people. And we see this around the world. I forget which temple this is now, but I love the Ankhs with their hands and holding the rods. But look how similar. This is Tiwanaku.
Yeah.
Tiwanaku. From Tiwanaku, when we're there and see how you have the same symbolism in basically the sun. This is a sun gate. And the sun and the rays, etc. Yeah, and we went to India. Kate and I've been to India, and we have Garuda, who is with his hook nose and the bird nose and the wings, and he's the mounted Vishnu carrying the sun. So the sun has incredible significance. And this is in India when we were there, and we were being told by our guides and the locals that they have a multiplicity of gods and spirits and whatnot. But what is the one that you can have a physical manifestation of? The sun. The sun is a physical manifestation of God. And creating God and the sun, or sun with a God, is very, seen around the world. I love this. This was in India. The right and true path leads to the formless one God, the sun. And we have here, this is, I don't know where it is now, but this was on one of the sarcophagi in the Cairo Museum. This is where I took this photograph, and notice how you have the deceased going to the stars, going to the sun, and making that connection. What did I write there? Oh yeah, the Egyptians, one version is that Egyptians believe when we die that in some cases could be reborn as stars in the sky, or as the sun. And the sun, of course, is our star. And you start to have questions. And I mean, serious physicists have now started talking about this, even though it's considered, highly controversial. The sun itself, could it be conscious at a certain level? Consciousness pervading the entire cosmos. Actually, some of that comes out of what now? Modern physics. Modern physics. You have to take that seriously. I've talked to some of you about this privately. Things like dark matter, dark energy, stars clumping in certain ways and seeming to move in certain patterns. I just throw this out for you to think about. Certain physicists and astrophysicists have to invoke all kinds of weird things like dark energy, dark matter, etc., etc. Well, think about a bunch of insects flying as a swarm. They're doing it because they're conscious and they're aware of each other. I know it's really radical, but could stars be doing things like that also? Am I making sense? If all of a sudden you assume there's a certain level of consciousness and motion, control of their own motion, and I'm not saying this and just being crazy. I mean, some serious astrophysicists are now entertaining such thoughts that, we have to get beyond our concept that only biological beings as we know them are conscious, are self-aware, are having movement. So I throw that out. I mean, that's really wild and radical, but does it tie in with maybe some of these ancient beliefs? Yeah. Here, this is, if I remember, this is from Tutankhamun, and notice connection to the stars. I think it's just very beautiful. And here, I think this was, before it was restored, I think this was in Abydos. Does that look like Abydos, Muhammad?
I think so.
I think it is. But anyway, the cartouches in the sky, going up to the sky with the stars. And we talked about this a little bit in the first edition, elaborated further in the Forgotten Civilization, the second edition. And yes, I'm working on a book, as I mentioned to you now. I'm always working on something. And a lot of this I'm going to flesh out, speculation. And I like to admit where it's just speculation, but flesh more of this out in the new book that I'm working on. In fact, you're getting a lot of tidbits, should we say, of things I'm going to develop further in my next book. But here, Katie, when we first met, this is like the first date type stuff. Well, actually, didn't we have a picture of it? That is our, that was the day we met.
The very first
right,
one.
Katie? The day we met?
And I made a proposal about hydrogen.
Yeah. Actually, I said to another group, and Katie proposed to me.
And they thought it was.
And they thought I was talking about marriage proposal. And no, she was making a scientific proposal, like a hypothesis, telling me about her theory. No, actually, that's the second picture, right?
The first one I hated. I told him he had to delete it.
Yeah, I took a picture of us, held it out, and I showed it to her, and she said, "Oh, that's no good. We got to take a second one." So this is our second picture. And you saw something like this already in the Valley of the Kings. You may have seen it, but I just put that in to be illustrative. But Katie talked about how this is our first date, right? Our first conversation. We're talking about hydrogen and the sun, and how the sun is classically known to form from hydrogen clouds in the sky that they combine and they compress gravitationally. And Katie was telling me her theory about how when we die, maybe our hydrogen escapes. It's light, it goes up. Could it carry information? Could it gather as stars, as clouds, as sun? Could this be a real sort of physical aspect of why so many cultures think in terms of the sun and stars? Even in The Lion King, isn't The Lion King looks up and talks about the ancestors being in the stars? So is it more than just a metaphor? And you have people, unfortunately he's deceased now, but Luc Montagnier, in 2008, Nobel Prize winner, who talked about how water can carry information, electromagnetic imprints. He did very careful studies of this, which have been replicated by other people. And I don't think it's a water per se. I'm convinced it's a hydrogen, which can encode information and store information. And I'm sure you've heard about him, and some people have said bad things about his work, but the late Emoto, people have heard about Emoto, similar type of work. And I want to point out that I'm a scientist, and I thinking replication is important. And yes, this has been replicated by other people in laboratories. It's not just a bunch of nonsense or new age woo-woo type stuff, to use that term. And so the concept is that when we physically die, this is the concept that Katie and I first talked about. When we physically die, as hydrogen and its constituent subatomic particles, but as we know physical things, hydrogen is proton and electron. We don't see quarks or other subatomic particles in a separate form in the world we live in. And we can talk about that more later. And what is the world we live in? Do we live in a hologram? Or I don't know all about that, but I know all the theories, and we could discuss that. But in the world that we are living, hydrogen could carry information about us. Hydrogen atoms at quantum level are certainly entangled. And if they're in your body together, it would be expected that they would be entangled. And even in any organism, they've been close together, entangled in a personality. They aggregate, they collect. And when you die and it's released, would they stay in communication, quote unquote, communication, entangled with each other? By the best quantum physics, yeah, they would. They're not going to unentangle necessarily. Some people have suggested that what makes the entire universe, I don't know if you've heard this, and space-time, and I just throw this out, is the entanglement of particles at different levels, at different ways. So again, just throwing this out. Diverse collections of hydrogen carrying different sets of information may be released from the physical body, and the personality, the consciousness of a person from this life to survive in a recognizable form in the next life, or whatever you want to call it, it may be important and necessary to reintegrate what I call the psychic components. The ancient Egyptians actually talked about this when you think about how they had the Ba and the Ka and the mummification, etc. And people know who Gurdjieff was? He talked about this too. He sometimes used the term crystallization, that you had to take these components and crystallize them or combine them. Something that John Anthony West and I used to talk about is a lot of these traditions, it's not assumed everyone goes on to the next life, so to speak, or maintains their integrity. You actually had to work on it. That was part of the spiritual work, the transformation, if you want to use the term alchemy of it. But it's not an assumption that everyone's soul, we'll just use that term for a moment, continues indefinitely. But it's the possibility that it can if you integrate in this life. So matter and consciousness are interlinked, but what's fundamental? I actually think information consciousness is ultimately fundamental. And this is one of my favorite physicists of all time, not Einstein, but Max Planck. You know who Max Planck is? And Max Planck was really the founder of quantum theory, which then, developed into quantum mechanics. He won the Nobel Prize in 1918 for that. And his is a quote, and I don't just take quotes off the internet. I want you to know that I research the quotes and find the original sources. So this is a real quote from him. He wrote in 1931, it was in context of an interview, "I regard consciousness as fundamental." Max Planck speaking. "I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing postulates consciousness. That consciousness is the ultimate reality, if you would. And matter and energy, everything else arises from consciousness. In our physical world, the most fundamental material expressions of consciousness, I think, are that we see in our real world, electrons and protons. That is hydrogen. Electrons and protons. This takes us back to Katie's theory and looking at ancient beliefs in more detail. Now, again, this is very controversial, but here is the copper statue, which we're going to see in the Egyptian Museum. And I think there are many different ways to interpret it. Well, one possibility beyond it being the statue and beyond it being the Khafre, the builder of the second pyramid, or associated with the second pyramid and the Sphinx, because there is that association. We'll talk about that more when we're at Giza. is that it also can be interpreted as essentially we become the sun, that we tie in, we're connected with the cosmos at a larger level. And again, I want to stress that symbols can have more than one meaning, more than one validity. So we will see this. It's a beautiful statue, but I'm going to give you a few highlights. Notice behind, you can't see it in this purposefully. But then when you go to this side, look, isn't that beautiful? Yeah, it's holding him and protecting him, if you would. But think in terms of plasma, the bird-headed man is essentially a bird-headed man. This, of course, is interpreted as the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. We talked about that. But can you also see it as a plasma symbol? Very similar to what Parat was talking about, the lion chair. Classically, the lion, and we see the lion and the lioness with the Sphinx, is associated with the sun. Those who know astrology, which goes back to the sacred science, that's the indication of the sun. And chairs being carried by, look, cascading rings. Does that look familiar from Parat's work? Cascading rings. So you get all these different aspects to it that can be interpreted different ways. The cascading rings, cascading rings being the plasma torus that Parat has found experimentally, and also simulations. There's another picture, so we can talk about, I think, at one level as we becoming the sun, the Birdman, equating with eternal life. So I want you to think about all these different possibilities. And of course, Horus is associated with the sun. We've seen that Raharakati, if I could say it. And, just beautiful imagery. And you've seen things like this, I think maybe when we went through the Valley of the Kings. And look, here we have Anubis preparing the deceased. But what's he on? You see the bed he's on with the sun, more or less the lion, and the cascading rings under him, just like we saw in the Copper throne. So all these possibilities, Anubis, Lord of the Dead, standing over the deceased who is lying on a bed or being carried on a lion bed, the sun, the plasma. So again, I want you to think about the multiple meanings of this. I don't know if you saw this or will be able to see it. I don't know if it's still on display, but this is another. I find this very, very interesting. This is traditionally known as a cow palate. And does it look like a cow with the horns? Yes. I'll admit that. Yeah, it does. And this is, they're dating it from 3650 to 300 BC. That's a traditional date for it. But yeah, it sort of looks like a cow with horns. But this also looks similar to some of the plasma configurations. Plus, look on the sides, and it takes the form of stars. So it makes you wonder, what are we looking at? Does it have multiple meanings, or is it misunderstood? Are we imposing our values and views on things? And again, does it tie in with sacred science? So that's where I'm going to end, but I have the advertisements. If you'd like to see some of this in person, not just in Egypt, some of you are coming with us to Turkey, and we'll explore this all more in Turkey firsthand. And also, I've mentioned this before, Katie and I devote time to the Organization for the Research of Ancient Cultures, also known as Oracle. So we're working on a documentary for this. If you go to our website and you want to see the little trailer, you can see it. But it features, you like him? Urfa Man. And the first thing in the trailer is about about the Sphinx in Egypt, and then going to Turkey. And not to plug it, but if you want to read more, most of you have read this, I think. So that's a little introduction to my work between yesterday and today. Thank you.
Me that the temperature difference between like atmospheric lightning and plasma is like orders of magnitude.
Yeah, it could be orders of magnitude. We don't know how hot magma, not magma, how hot a solar outburst hitting could get to be.
So my question is, are there like any features or characteristics in vitrified rock that would distinguish between atmospheric lightning and plasma touching?
Yes, I think the major feature we can be confident of right now is that when you get huge strewn fields of fulgurites and fulgurite type glasses and whatnot, that doesn't happen from atmospheric lightning. That the most intense atmospheric lightning that we know of is still fairly localized. When I say fairly localized, you might even hit an area and have intense, lightning and something, several times the size of this room, but you don't get covering 400 square kilometers, much as 2,500 square kilometers, or the intensity of what I showed you on the Giza Plateau, etc. And so the depth, how intense it is, we can pick that up. I do want to point out that with lightning, even modern lightning, it has been documented. For instance, I think it was in Texas, there was a major lightning strike that was observed, and it actually gouged out a small crater. So you can get cratering and that type of thing from lightning. So we don't know exactly what happened because we haven't observed it with a major solar outburst, and I'll just call it non-atmospheric lightning. But I think the main thing, isn't it beautiful how we're selling money? I just couldn't help but see that. So I think really what we're looking at now is intensity, geographic coverage, that type of thing, to try to distinguish between them.
Okay, and my next question is, you spoke about precession and given a nice round number.
Precession.
It's, around 26,000 years.
Yeah, the entire precessional cycle for everyone, sometimes known as a Platonic year, is about 26,000 years. Somewhere between 24 and 26,000 years, closer right now to 26,000 years, but it actually varies over time. Not all precessional cycles are exactly the same period.
So I guess where I'm getting at is like, on average, that'd be like on the surface of the Earth, that'd be, a shift of the night sky by around 1 degree every 70.
1 degree, the classic view is 1 degree every 72 years.
I'm just trying to think of how the ancients may have realized about precession and thinking about the average lifespan of humans that date back to
something
ago.
I've found when studying the ancient records and the ancient sites, etc., is I think that I am absolutely convinced they thought in terms of longer temporal cycles. They kept records, whether it was mentally or written. I think I may have mentioned before with Australian population, we have that they kept oral records. We now can demonstrate valid oral records since the end of the last ice age, 12,000 or more years, passing things down and keeping it intact. And there are traditions that are totally oral they say even Homer and the Iliad and Odyssey started as oral traditions that were then later written. And once you have literacy, and I'm convinced you have literacy by Göbekli Tepe time, so before the end of the last ice age, I think they were much more attuned of looking at long-term temporal cycles. I think it's really a quite new phenomenon that we think in America, for instance, in terms of 4-year election cycle for the president, 2-year election cycle for the House of Representatives. 6 years is so long for a senator. Do you see my point? Or, planning for 5 years, like a 5-year plan. That they didn't think that way. I think they saw themselves and they had a perception of much longer cycles. So I think there were many levels of record keeping over a long period of time. I think that ties in with what we're seeing in Egypt right now. Egypt is a unified civilization. Dynastic Egypt goes from the first dynasty, the very early period, up until the 30th or so dynasty, and then the Ptolemaic period. We're talking thousands of years. We're talking a good, let's just say round numbers, 3,000 years, which for many Americans, many Europeans, is unimaginable to have a continuity like that. So I don't know if that helps a little bit.
No, it does. Yeah, thank you.
I just want to stay on the subject with Stephen's point about precessional cycles. You worked with a book with Rob Duvall.
Yeah.
About the Orion correlation.
Yes.
And suggested that the Orion's belt and the stars of it were over the three pyramids of Giza, and that the Sphinx was looking out and seeing.
We spoke about yesterday.
In the age of Leo.
Yes, exactly.
We talked about
Mehi
that.
coming up on the horizon. That's going back 10,600 years, a suggestion for how old that construction may have been. But did not John Anthony West suggest, or at least question, if it was during the Younger Dryas event and the weather was so bad, how would they have built at that? And is it possible that it went back to
John Anthony West and I often talked about this, where I would suggest like the age of Leo. You're absolutely right. Age of Leo would tie in with the end of the last ice age and the end of the Younger Dryas. And I think, we're talking that period. 26,000 years earlier, approximately, you would have another age of Leo, if you would. And John Anthony West often, I think this is really pushing the boundaries, but I present it on behalf of him. He's deceased now. He suggested that in some cases, you could be talking an entire precessional cycle earlier, which would push the boundaries, say, let's just round numbers, instead of 10,000 BC, 36,000 BC, 26,000 years earlier. And he suggested that, some of the mythologies around the world, including in Egypt, the quote mythologies, suggested that was a possibility. Now, very interestingly, Michael Witzel, who I mentioned, from Harvard, senior faculty member at Harvard, he has come to essentially the same conclusion that some of these traditions and origins and whatnot, and he's talking, verbal traditions that were then written down later, but he's convinced, he actually has suggested some of them go back 60,000 or more years. I mean, so several precessional cycles, which makes John Anthony West look conservative at that point. So this is, it's a developing field, and, it's very controversial when you're talking about such long periods of time and pushing some of the traditions so far back. But it's interesting, I think.
What did Thomas Gold base his 10,000-year cycle conjecture on?
He based it, the reason actually I think he said 10,000 years is he was convinced, I believe, this is my interpretation of reading his work and from my geological background, he was convinced that this happened at the end of the last ice age. And back then, especially in the 60s and even up to the 80s when I was a young graduate student, we didn't really know when the ice age ended. And we used the round number of about people would throw it around either 10,000 years ago or 10,000 BC. And I think he basically was thinking in terms of the last ice age was about 10,000 years ago, and that we were probably going into another period of instability. So he just threw out. So just used a general number of 10,000 years. But he didn't have any real solid data in terms of, precise isotope data as we do now in, beryllium studies, et cetera. But I think he was quite accurate for his time, because we now see about a 10,000 year cycle punctuated by about 12 or so 100-year periods of instability, 1,200 to 2,000 year.
So it wasn't based on observations of phenomena outside the solar system that might be inside.
Yes. In fact, this is very interesting right now, because in the last couple of decades, there's been more and more work on solar-like stars demonstrating that they go through these cycles in these periodicities and also can have what are known as micronovae. Supernovae destroys everything and destroys the star itself, but micronovae, where you throw off material in all directions. When I say material, electromagnetic, charged particles, etc. Some of which can actually come together, as suggested, and you see this around other stars where you see debris fields, shells of debris, physical debris debris from a micronova. So in some cases, it does clump together as we'll call particles. But when I say particles, some could be as big as the ship that could impact a planet. So there's not an absolute distinction between a solar outburst phenomenon, or let me put it this way: you could have I believe you could have a solar outburst phenomenon. I believe based on the evidence, and you could have some physical impactors hitting the Earth or another planet. But the primary phenomenon is a solar outburst, not just a comet coming from elsewhere. Does that make sense? There's also evidence, and it's still being developed, that a comet or comet coming in from, say the asteroid belt or coming in from outside the solar system, being attracted to the sun and impacting the sun at the right time, more or less when the sun is in already a somewhat destabilized position or destabilized state of disequilibrium, as one astrophysicist has called it, could set off an outburst. So a cometary, even relatively small, hitting the sun, a cometary impact on the sun could potentially set off a solar outburst. And if they come in swarms, you might have, maybe a comet actually hitting the Earth, but others hitting the sun. And the primary phenomenon is actually the solar outburst that's affecting things, even if you have some comet evidence, good comet evidence, which I'm not convinced of yet, but that you could. So it's not necessarily a either or. It could be a much more complex situation.
Why Orion? Why Leo?
Why?
Ancient civilizations. In Egypt.
That's a good question. Why Orion? Why Leo? Etc. One Sirius. Okay, Sirius is a very, very important star in the sky, brightest star, etc. And from an astrophysical point of view, there is still very iffy and very sketchy. But most stars now, whether they knew this or not in ancient times, I don't know. But certainly Sirius is very important for the flooding of the Nile and the rising. There's all these practical things. But interestingly, astrophysically, we now have lots of evidence that most stars are born with another star when they're formed, and they come in binary pairs, in some cases trinary, even 4-star systems, etc., but they become less stable. But two stars are born together, and most stars seem to be in binary pairs, or at least begin in binary pairs. If that's the case, and our sun as a star was part of a binary pair, whereas its partner, there are some suggestions that, for instance, based on precessional changes and lack of precession seen in Sirius, that it may well be our binary pair. So that's another thing. Katie.
It would sort of make Orion our papa.
Yeah.
Our son. Our papa, our father.
Because Orion and Sirius are so closely connected as a dog star. There's a guy who's done a lot of work on this and funded other people, because he's not an astrophysicist himself, but he has money. And he's interested in this topic, looking at the possibility that Sirius in particular is our companion star. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that might be a possibility.
Can you remember his name?
Which one? The guy, Walter Cruttenden. Cruttenden, yeah. So there's a lot of interesting things. I'm not going to give you definitive answers when I don't have it, but I'll tell you what I know. So I know, does that make some sense?
A lot. I mean, we've seen, even with Orion, you look at the glyphs and you look at the dress on the drawings, and they are Orion with the belt. I mean, 4 stars. And
Orion seems to be very important. And Orion was associated with who in Egypt? Muhammad knows. Osiris. Osiris. I don't think that's coincidental.
The Mayan and it's a universal.
Yeah. Osiris. Orion, Osiris. Okay, I think I'm being told by Max because when he stands up there, he stares at me.
Max stands with his
I know I
hands
have
on his
to end. So let's